My name is Kiara, and at 32 years old, I learned that the most dangerous predators do not hide in dark alleys. They smile at you across the dining room table. I was lying in a hospital bed staring at the sterile white ceiling when I heard the whispers outside my door. It was my sister-in-law, Tasha, asking my mother-in-law, Beverly, if she was absolutely sure I drank it. Beverly just laughed that cold, sharp laugh I had heard 1,000 times and told her not to worry because by tomorrow morning everything would be theirs. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I managed to reach for my phone with heavy, uncoordinated fingers and send a single text to my attorney Darius. I told him to start the plan right now. If you are watching this and you have ever realized the people you love are actually your worst enemies, hit the like button and subscribe. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments, because this story is going to prove exactly why you should always sleep with one eye open. I slipped my phone back under the thin hospital mattress, just as the heavy wooden door creaked open. I let my eyes flutter shut, letting my breathing slow to a deep, rhythmic pace, mimicking the heavy slumber of the deeply sedated. The thick fog of the drug was still pulling at my brain, making it terrifyingly easy to play the part of the unconscious victim. I felt the shift in the air pressure as someone entered the room. The sharp, expensive scent of Tom Ford cologne hit my senses instantly. Julian, my husband of 5 years, the man who had stood at the altar and promised to protect me, was standing right beside my hospital bed. I waited for the gentle touch of his hand on my cheek, or the concerned whisper of my name. I waited for him to call out to a nurse to ask for an update on my vitals, or to simply hold my hand out of love. Instead, there was only absolute calculating silence. I felt the mattress shift as he leaned over me. His hands did not reach for my face to brush away my hair. They went straight for my right arm, which lay limp on top of the scratchy blanket. Julian grabbed my wrist. His grip was entirely clinical, completely devoid of any warmth or affection. He pulled my hand toward him, and I could hear the faint rustle of his tailored suit jacket. Through the tiny sliver of my eyelashes, I risked a glance. Julian was looking over his shoulder, checking the brightly lit hallway through the rectangular glass panel of the hospital door. Satisfied that no medical staff were watching, he pulled his own phone from his pocket. No, it was not his phone. It was mine. He must have seen the edge of the case protruding from under the mattress where I had hastily shoved it seconds before. My heart pounded so fiercely against my chest, I was certain the heart monitor hooked up to me would betray my consciousness. But the steady rhythmic beeping continued, unchanged, masking the absolute panic surging through my veins. Julian pressed his thumb against the side button to wake the screen. The glaring blue light illuminated his handsome face, highlighting the intense predatory focus in his eyes. He lifted my limp hand, guiding my right index finger toward the screen with practiced precision. The biometric lock. He was bypassing my security. A soft vibration signaled that the phone had unlocked. He let my hand drop carelessly back onto the bed as if I were nothing more than a broken mannequin. I watched through the blurry veil of my eyelashes as his fingers danced rapidly across the screen. The layout of the application was unmistakable, even distorted by my compromised vision. It was my secure banking portal. The digital vault that held the liquid capital from my latest and greatest achievement. Just a week ago, I had finalized the crowning milestone of my career as a self-made commercial real estate developer. After years of fighting tooth and nail in an aggressively male-dominated industry, constantly having to prove my worth and my vision as a young Black woman, I had successfully flipped a massive portfolio of urban properties. I had spent countless sleepless nights negotiating with city planners, arguing with contractors, and pouring my soul into acquiring abandoned warehouses and dilapidated lots. I transformed them into vibrant community spaces and affordable commercial hubs specifically designed for Black-owned businesses in Atlanta. The buyout from a larger corporate entity had been monumental, bringing in a staggering $4,500,000 in pure profit. It was money meant to secure my future, meant to fund my next massive community project, meant to be the unbreakable foundation of the empire I was building from the ground up. And now my own husband was transferring it all away. I wanted to scream until my lungs burned. I wanted to sit up, rip the IV from my arm, and snatch the phone from his greedy hands. I wanted to demand how he could do this to the woman he swore to cherish. But the heavy sedative still coursing through my blood reminded me of exactly how far he and his toxic family were willing to go. If I confronted him now, isolated, vulnerable, and physically incapacitated in a hospital room, I had no idea what he might do next. I had to let him finish. I had to watch him steal my life's work right in front of me. My mind raced back to the events of the afternoon, frantically piecing together the treacherous puzzle. Julian had insisted we go to his mother's sprawling estate in Buckhead for a celebratory lunch. Beverly had greeted me at the door with fake enthusiasm, kissing my cheek, while her eyes coldly assessed my tailored suit, sizing me up like a walking dollar sign. Tasha was there too, pacing around the kitchen and complaining loudly about the latest shipping delays with her failing designer fashion brand. Tasha was always drowning in debt, constantly chasing a lavish lifestyle for social media that she could never legitimately afford. During the lunch, they had showered me with hollow praises. Beverly made a grand theatrical speech about how proud she was to have such a successful daughter-in-law, seamlessly weaving the narrative that my success was somehow a triumph for the entire Blackwell family. I should have known then. They did not view my money as my own hard-earned reward. To them, it was a communal family asset waiting to be claimed by the most entitled members. Then came the tea. Tasha had insisted on making her special hibiscus ginger tea, supposedly to help me relax after the grueling stress of the acquisition. I remembered taking the first sip. It was overly sweet, thick, with an excessive amount of honey, clearly added to mask a bitter chemical aftertaste. I had brushed it off as just a strong, overly steeped herbal blend. Within 20 minutes, the dining room had started to spin. The elegant chandelier above the table seemed to sway and tilt, and the voices of my husband and his family faded into a distorted, muffled echo. The last thing I remembered before the blackness completely swallowed me was Julian staring at me from across the table. His expression was completely devoid of surprise or concern as I slumped forward into my plate. They had planned this down to the minute. The celebration was nothing but a trap. The tea was laced with a heavy sedative specifically designed to knock me out so they could access my biometric data without a fight. They needed me unconscious but alive, just long enough to drain my accounts and legally bind the digital transfers. A quiet chime from the phone snapped my attention back to the sterile hospital room. Julian let out a soft breath of triumph that made my skin crawl. He locked the screen, wiped it carefully on his suit trousers to remove his fingerprints, and slipped it back onto the bedside table, exactly where he thought he had found it. He adjusted his pristine cuffs, smoothed his designer jacket, and finally looked down at my face. For a fleeting second, I wondered if he felt any genuine guilt for what he had just done. But the faint, arrogant smirk playing on his lips gave me the definitive answer. He felt nothing but victory. He turned on his heel and walked out of the hospital room, the heavy door clicking softly shut behind him. The moment he was gone, the suffocating silence of the room pressed down on me, weighing heavier than the blankets. I lay there paralyzed by the lingering physical effects of the drug and the monumental scale of the betrayal. The man I slept next to every night, the woman who called me daughter, the sister-in-law, I had tried so hard to embrace, they had all conspired to poison me and rob me blind. I slowly flexed my fingers, fighting against the heavy lethargy pulling at my muscles. Every movement took monumental effort, but I managed to reach out and pull the phone from the table. It took 3 tries to get my eyes to focus on the bright screen. I opened my banking app, pressing my thumb to the sensor with a shaking hand. The dashboard loaded, confirming my worst fears. Available balance $0.00. Over $4 million vanished in the blink of an eye. A single tear slipped down my cheek, hot and furious. They thought they had won the ultimate prize. They thought I was just a naive workaholic who would wake up confused, disoriented, and devastatingly broke. They thought they could execute a flawless financial heist, leaving me with nothing but a medical bill and a ruined future while they lived out their wealthy fantasies. But they severely underestimated the woman they were dealing with. I did not build a commercial real estate empire by being a helpless victim. I built it by anticipating the market, by recognizing bad investments from a mile away, and by always having an airtight contingency plan. Julian thought he was the financial genius in our marriage simply because he worked in wealth management, but he was merely a middleman, playing with other people's money. I was the developer. I built things from the ground up, and I knew exactly how to tear them down to the foundation. Darius, my razor-sharp attorney, was already in motion. I had seen the warning signs months ago when Julian started asking too many specific probing questions about my corporate structures and routing numbers. I had felt the subtle shift in Beverly's demands for extravagant gifts, pretending they were necessities. I knew Tasha's boutique was facing foreclosure, and Julian was desperately trying to hide it. I had fully prepared for their greed, but I had not anticipated the physical attack. That was their fatal mistake. By crossing the line from financial manipulation to physical harm, they ignited a fire in me that would not be extinguished until their entire world was reduced to ashes. I closed the banking app and stared at the dark screen of my phone, my reflection barely visible in the glass. I was temporarily stripped of my liquid wealth, trapped in a hospital bed, recovering from being poisoned by my own family. But as I lay there, letting the pure, unadulterated anger sharpen my focus, I realized I had never been more powerful. I knew their entire playbook, and they had no idea I was awake. The game had just begun, and by the time I was finished playing, Julian, Beverly, and Tasha would beg for the days when they only had to worry about being broke. The morning sun pierced through the harsh hospital blinds, signaling the end of my overnight observation. Dr. Evans walked in, holding my chart with a reassuring but highly clinical smile. He pronounced my official diagnosis as severe food poisoning coupled with extreme physical exhaustion. He prescribed heavy rest, continuous hydration, and a full week away from any high-stress environments. Julian stood beside the doctor, nodding solemnly and playing the role of the deeply concerned husband to absolute perfection. He asked all the right questions about my recovery timeline and dietary restrictions, holding my hand with a gentle squeeze that made my stomach physically churn. I played my part too, keeping my voice weak and my gaze unfocused, murmuring quiet thanks to the medical staff. I needed them to believe I was entirely broken down, completely devoid of the sharp edge that had built my career in commercial real estate. The drive back to our estate in Sandy Springs was agonizingly quiet. Julian drove his luxury sedan with careful precision, occasionally glancing at me through the rearview mirror. I kept my head resting against the cool leather of the passenger seat, pretending to sleep. My mind, however, was racing through 1,000 different scenarios, calculating my next moves with the precision of a seasoned chess player. When we finally pulled into the wide circular driveway of the home I had purchased, with my first major commercial flip, I felt a fresh wave of violation. This house was my personal sanctuary, my safe space, and it was about to be completely invaded. Before I even stepped through the massive wrought iron double doors, the invasion began. Beverly and Tasha were already inside, waiting in the grand foyer with their designer luggage stacked neatly by the sweeping mahogany staircase. Beverly rushed forward, her arms outstretched, wrapping me in a suffocating embrace that smelled strongly of expensive Chanel perfume and cheap deceit. She declared that they were moving in immediately to take care of me. She insisted that Julian was far too busy managing his wealth management firm to provide the round-the-clock care a recovering woman truly needed. Tasha stood right behind her, echoing the sentiment with a wide, sugary smile that completely lacked any genuine warmth. I allowed them to guide me upstairs, leaning heavily on Julian to sell the illusion of my physical weakness. They tucked me into the plush duvet of the master suite, fluffing the pillows and drawing the heavy blackout curtains to plunge the room into a deep, restful darkness. Beverly promised to make me some mild chicken broth and ordered me to sleep. The moment I heard the heavy click of the bedroom door latch shutting behind them, my entire demeanor changed. The fragile, exhausted wife vanished in an instant. I sat up, throwing off the covers with silent swiftness. I moved to the back of my expansive walk-in closet, pushing aside rows of tailored business suits and designer shoes until I reached a false panel near the floorboards. Behind it lay a small fireproof safe. I punched in the access code, retrieved a cheap prepaid burner laptop I had purchased months ago, and brought it back to the bed. I booted it up, connecting to a secure hidden wireless network I maintained completely separate from the main house system. My fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating through the encrypted layers of my banking portals. Even though I had watched Julian initiate the transfer from my hospital bed, seeing the official numbers on a high-definition screen was a completely different kind of shock. The primary account associated with my holding company read absolute zero. The $4,500,000 from the commercial real estate flip was gone, transferred out via a heavily authenticated wire routing system. I clicked through the transaction history, my eyes scanning the digital footprints. Julian had used his high-level access and the forged biometric verification to bypass every single security protocol I had put in place. I did not scream. I did not throw the laptop against the wall. I simply sat there in the dark, absorbing the cold, hard reality of my situation. I carefully logged out, cleared the browser history, and returned the burner laptop to its hiding place behind the false panel. I climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. I knew that confronting them right now would be the most foolish mistake I could possibly make. If I screamed and demanded my money back, Julian would instantly realize I was aware of the theft. He would leverage his position to freeze me out entirely, using the power of attorney I knew he had to be hiding somewhere. I had to watch them. I had to let them get comfortable in their perceived victory. For the next 2 days, I remained confined to the master suite, acting the part of the ailing invalid. Beverly brought me trays of bland food and glass after glass of water, always watching me with a hawkish intensity masquerading as maternal care. I drank the water but covertly dumped the food, ensuring I remained weak and lethargic whenever they were in the room. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, I decided it was time to test my mobility. I slipped out of bed, wrapping a thick silk robe around my shoulders, and quietly padded down the carpeted hallway toward the sweeping balcony that overlooked the main living area. From my hidden vantage point, I looked down at the sprawling open-concept living room. Tasha was parading back and forth in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling mirrors, running her hands over the lapels of a brand-new structured jacket. It was a Balmain blazer, midnight black with heavy gold buttons and sharp, aggressive shoulders. I knew the exact piece because I had seen it in a luxury boutique window just last week. It retailed for a cool $3,000. Tasha spun around, snapping a rapid series of photos on her phone, clearly preparing her next batch of social media content. Seeing her wearing that blazer ignited a fierce, burning clarity within me. Tasha was a spectacular failure in the business world. She had launched a so-called luxury fashion brand 3 years ago, fueled entirely by Julian's relentless financial bailouts. Her business was drowning in massive vendor debt, facing multiple lawsuits for unpaid invoices, and struggling to maintain even a facade of operational legitimacy. Yet here she was, showing off a $3,000 blazer, acting like a self-made mogul. She was wearing my money. She was wearing the late nights, the stressful negotiations, and the grueling labor I had endured to close that massive real estate deal. Beverly walked into the living room holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, her posture radiating supreme arrogance. She complimented Tasha on the blazer, telling her she looked every bit the successful Atlanta elite. Beverly was the ultimate social climber, an active board member of highly exclusive country clubs and elite societal organizations. She spent her days attending charity luncheons and hosting lavish garden parties, constantly projecting an image of generational wealth and untouchable status. But I knew the truth. I realized in that specific moment that my hard-earned money had been the invisible engine funding their entire social facade. Julian's salary as a wealth management director was substantial, but it was nowhere near enough to support Beverly's exorbitant country club fees, Tasha's failing business ventures, and his own insatiable appetite for luxury cars and tailored suits. They were living light years beyond their actual means. I had been the oblivious bankroll, the silent financial pillar holding up their precarious house of cards. They resented my ambition. They mocked my dedication to my work, but they were absolutely ruthless in their willingness to harvest the fruits of my labor. The realization was sickening, but also deeply empowering. I knew exactly what motivated them: pure, unadulterated greed. I watched them laugh together in my living room, celebrating a victory they believed was completely secure. Tasha posed for another photo, her fake smile gleaming brightly under the expensive recessed lighting. Beverly adjusted a decorative vase on the coffee table, moving with the entitled confidence of a woman who believed she finally owned the castle. I slowly backed away from the balcony railing, ensuring my footsteps made absolutely no sound against the plush carpet. The anger inside me had distilled into something cold, sharp, and highly focused. Later that evening, the grand house grew quiet as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. I lay in bed listening intently to the muffled sounds of the house. I heard the heavy front door open and close, signaling Julian's return from his office. The low rumble of his voice drifted up the staircase, followed by Beverly's sharp, distinct tones. My throat felt dry, and I realized I genuinely needed water. I pushed myself out of bed, leaving the heavy silk robe behind, so I could move more silently in my lightweight pajamas. I crept down the darkened hallway, stepping carefully on the edges of the floorboards to avoid any betraying creaks. The house was expansive, and the journey to the kitchen required passing through the formal dining room. As I neared the arched entryway leading into the massive chef's kitchen, I heard the distinct rustle of heavy paper. I stopped instantly, pressing my back flat against the cool plaster of the hallway wall. The ambient lighting from the kitchen spilled onto the hardwood floor, casting long, distorted shadows. Julian and Beverly were standing near the marble island, their voices hushed but intensely focused. I held my breath, closing my eyes and straining to catch every single word. Beverly's tone was sharp, commanding, and stripped of all the fake maternal warmth she had been projecting for the past 3 days. She sounded like a ruthless corporate raider directing a hostile takeover. Julian responded with low murmurs of agreement, his voice lacking any of the confident swagger he usually displayed. He was following her lead, entirely subservient to her master plan. I leaned forward just a fraction of an inch, peering around the edge of the arched entryway. Beverly was sliding a thick stack of legal documents across the pristine marble surface toward Julian. The papers were heavily flagged with brightly colored sticky notes indicating signature lines. Julian picked up a sleek silver pen, twirling it nervously between his fingers as he stared down at the documents. The tension in the kitchen was palpable, thick with criminal intent and desperate ambition. "You need to move quickly on this," Beverly commanded, her voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper. "We cannot afford any delays with the LLC transfers. The Delaware accounts are prepped, but we need the final authorization to lock her out of the holding company entirely." Julian nodded, his gaze fixed on the paperwork. "I know, Mother. I have the secondary authentication ready. But getting her to sign the release forms without reading them is going to be difficult. She is meticulous about contracts." Beverly let out a low, humorless chuckle that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. She tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against the top page of the legal stack. "She is currently surviving on plain broth and heavy sedatives, Julian. She can barely keep her eyes open for more than 10 minutes at a time." Beverly pushed the documents closer to his hands, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, predatory light. "Get her to sign these while she is still groggy," Beverly commanded. "Tell her it is just routine medical insurance paperwork. She trusts you. Use that." I held my breath as I backed away from the kitchen archway. The shadows clung to me like a second skin as I retraced my steps down the long corridor and up the grand mahogany staircase. My bare feet made absolutely no sound against the plush carpet. I slipped back into the master suite, gently closing the heavy wooden door, just as I heard Julian's footsteps approaching the base of the stairs. I scrambled beneath the thick duvet, regulating my breathing into the slow, steady rhythm of a heavily sedated woman. The door handle clicked. I kept my eyes shut tight. Julian entered the room, lingering at the foot of the bed for a long, agonizing minute. I could feel his cold gaze scanning my motionless form. Satisfied that I was fully incapacitated, he walked into the master bathroom and closed the door. The morning light broke through the gaps in the blackout curtains, casting harsh lines across the bedroom floor. It was Tuesday. The house was quiet, except for the distinct rhythmic sound of water hitting the marble tiles in the master shower. Julian was a creature of absolute habit. He took exactly 20 minutes in the shower, followed by 10 minutes of grooming at the vanity. I had a precise 30-minute window to execute my next move. The lingering effects of Tasha's poison tea still tugged at my extremities, making my limbs feel like lead, but pure adrenaline surged through my veins, incinerating the fatigue. I threw off the heavy duvet and swung my legs over the side of the bed. I did not bother with slippers. I moved with urgent, silent purpose, slipping out of the bedroom and gliding down the hallway toward the opposite wing of the house. Julian's home office was his impenetrable fortress. It was a space heavily adorned with dark oak panels, leather wingback chairs, and framed degrees that screamed corporate arrogance. He always kept the door locked, but locking doors in a house owned by a commercial real estate developer was a laughable defense. I had spent years buying, gutting, and flipping historic commercial properties across Atlanta. I knew every structural vulnerability of a building, and I knew how to bypass standard residential security mechanisms with my eyes closed. I slid a thin, rigid piece of tension wire I kept hidden in a potted plant outside his door into the locking mechanism. With a quick practice twist, the lock clicked open. I pushed the door open, slipped inside, and shut it silently behind me. The room smelled of stale scotch and expensive leather. My eyes immediately locked onto his desk. Sitting squarely in the center of the immaculate glass surface was his prized Italian leather briefcase. It was the same briefcase he took to his wealth management firm every single day. I approached the desk, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The briefcase, secured by dual combination locks, presented a slightly more complex challenge. However, Julian's arrogance was always his greatest weakness. He believed he was the smartest man in any room, which made him incredibly predictable. I rolled the brass dials, entering the month and year we were married, followed by the month and year of his promotion. The lock sprang open with a sharp, satisfying snap. I flipped the leather top back, exposing the organized chaos of his financial treachery. I carefully lifted the thick stack of legal documents resting on top. These were the papers I had seen Beverly sliding across the kitchen island the night before. I spread them out across the glass desk, my eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal jargon. My breath hitched in my throat. Lying right in front of me was a comprehensive, legally binding power of attorney document. But it was not just a draft. It was fully executed. It granted Julian complete unrestricted authority over all my financial accounts, my personal assets, and most devastatingly, full executive control over every single limited liability company registered under my development firm. I stared at the signature line. Someone had perfectly forged my handwriting. Every loop, every sharp angle of my signature was replicated with chilling accuracy. But a forged signature was completely useless without an official notary seal. I traced my finger down to the bottom corner of the page. There, stamped in stark blue ink, was the official seal of a registered public notary. I recognized the name immediately. It was one of Julian's subordinate wealth managers at his firm. Julian had leveraged his legitimate corporate career, utilizing his vast professional network to fraudulently authenticate a document that effectively handed him the keys to my entire empire. He had orchestrated a seamless, legally binding illusion of my consent. The sheer audacity of the forgery sent a wave of icy fury crashing over me. This was not a crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment lapse in judgment. This was a calculated, meticulously planned corporate heist executed by the man I loved. He had used the prestige of his firm and the trust of his colleagues to legitimize his theft. I dug deeper into this briefcase, pulling out thick manila folders bursting with bank statements, margin call notices, and threatening letters from private creditors. As I rapidly flipped through the chaotic financial records, the true motive behind his monstrous betrayal finally emerged from the shadows. Julian was not just greedy, he was utterly catastrophically desperate. The folders detailed a staggering mountain of hidden gambling debts and aggressively leveraged investments that had completely collapsed. He had been secretly trading on margin, gambling massive sums of money on volatile tech stocks and losing catastrophically. The losses extended far beyond his corporate salary. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to incredibly dangerous private lenders who were clearly demanding immediate repayment. But the $4.5 million he stole from my real estate flip was only the beginning of his destructive crusade. I opened a bright red folder at the very bottom of the briefcase, and the contents made my blood run absolutely cold. It was a stack of commercial loan applications. Julian was in the final stages of securing a massive high-interest loan to cover the remaining balance of his disastrous debts, and he was using our marital home as the primary collateral. I gripped the edge of the glass desk, my knuckles turning white as a wave of pure, unfiltered rage washed over me. This house in Sandy Springs was not just a piece of property. It was the physical manifestation of my independence and my grind. I had bought this sprawling estate entirely with my own money, using the profits from my very first successful commercial development project. I bought it long before Julian and I even met. I had designed every room, picked out every fixture, and paid off the mortgage with the sweat off my own brow. Because of the forged power of attorney, Julian now possessed the fraudulent legal authority to borrow against my most prized asset. He was preparing to leverage the roof over my head, risking the home I built to save his own pathetic skin. If he defaulted on the loan which his financial records guaranteed, the bank would foreclose on the property. He was perfectly willing to render me completely homeless, stripping away my sanctuary to cover his toxic gambling addiction. He intended to drain my life savings, steal the home I purchased, and leave me destitute while he and his treacherous family walked away clean. The betrayal was so profound it physically ached, but the pain quickly calcified into a weapon. I was not going to let them take a single brick of my house. I pulled my hidden burner phone from the pocket of my pajama pants. I ensured the camera flash was disabled and the shutter sound was muted. I hovered over the glass desk, my hands moving with surgical precision. I snapped high-resolution photographs of every single page. I captured the forged power of attorney, the fraudulent notary stamps, the threatening letters from his aggressive creditors, and the loan applications leveraging my house. I documented every ounce of his financial desperation, creating an airtight digital archive of his federal crimes. I captured the final page just as the shower shut off. The window was closing. I hastily stacked the legal documents, matching the exact order I found them in. I lowered the heavy leather lid, snapping the dual brass locks shut, and scrambled the combinations back to random numbers. As I wiped the glass desk, my phone vibrated violently. It was a text message from my attorney Darius. The words burned into my vision. The funds were moved to a shell company in Delaware. If we don't act in 72 hours, the money will be offshore and untraceable. I locked the screen and shoved the device deep into my pocket. The countdown had officially begun. I had to act fast. Now. I slipped silently from the office, easing the heavy oak door shut, just as the bathroom lock clicked open. I glided back into the master bedroom, sliding beneath the duvet seconds before Julian entered, completely oblivious to the fact that his financial execution had just been intercepted and documented. The immediate problem was getting out of the house. I needed to see Darius face to face to execute the countermeasure, but my mother-in-law and sister-in-law were stationed downstairs like prison wardens. I needed a distraction that would grant me absolute privacy for at least 3 uninterrupted hours. I let out a sharp, practiced groan, pressing the heels of my hands against my temples and rolling frantically on the mattress. When Julian rushed to my side, I put on the performance of a lifetime, mimicking the exact agonizing symptoms of a cluster migraine. I told him the light was like shattered glass piercing my eyes, that the nausea was violently overwhelming, and that I needed absolute darkness. Julian immediately summoned his mother. Beverly bustled into the room, her feigned concern making my stomach turn. I demanded no interruptions under any circumstances, locking the master suite door from the inside the moment they retreated. I stripped off my pajamas and quickly dressed in a simple black athletic ensemble designed for stealth. I grabbed a pair of oversized dark sunglasses and a black baseball cap. My house featured a service staircase that led directly from the master suite and adjoining laundry corridor down into the garage. I had built it specifically for household staff to move invisibly throughout the property, never imagining I would use it to escape my own home. I moved down the narrow wooden steps, listening to the muffled sounds of Tasha laughing obnoxiously in the living room directly above me. I bypassed my highly recognizable luxury vehicle and slipped into the passenger seat of an old, reliable sedan I kept exclusively for rough construction site visits. I kept the headlights completely off until I rolled safely past the heavy iron security gates, melting invisibly into the bustling flow of Atlanta morning traffic. Darius worked in a very sleek, tall, glass-paneled high-rise, right in the heart of Midtown. His personal workspace was dimly lit, surrounded by towering walls of dense legal texts and the constant low hum of a white noise machine designed to prevent corporate eavesdropping. He was a brilliant, ruthless shark in a tailored Italian suit, the kind of high-powered attorney who saw numbers like a second language and complex legal loopholes like open doors. When I walked in, tossing my cap and sunglasses onto his vintage leather sofa, his eyes widened at the fierce, unyielding intensity radiating from me. I did not offer any polite morning greetings. I slapped my burner phone onto his mahogany desk and ordered him to cast the encrypted images directly to his secure wall monitor. The massive screen instantly flickered to life, illuminating the dark room with the damning evidence of the forged power of attorney Julian used and the disastrous, deeply hidden loan applications. Darius leaned forward, his elbows resting heavily on the polished wood of his desk, his sharp eyes darting rapidly across the forged biometric transfers and fake secondary authentication stamps. He typed furiously into his encrypted terminal, running the stolen routing numbers through his proprietary tracking software. The glowing green text reflected sharply in his glasses as the horrifying truth materialized on the screen. The $4.5 million had not simply vanished into the digital ether. It had been meticulously routed into a highly secured Delaware shell company. Darius clicked on the corporate registry, pulling up the heavily concealed board of directors for the phantom entity. There, glowing in stark white text against the black background, were the names. The shell company was registered under the name of Tasha, naming her as the sole executive officer. Right below her, listed as the primary board member and the sole financial signatory, was Beverly. The absolute, unmitigated audacity of it stole the breath directly from my lungs. Julian was not just stealing my money to secretly cover his catastrophic gambling debts. He was filtering my life work directly into the hands of his mother and sister, willfully funding their lavish, fake lifestyles with the sweat of my daily grind. They had orchestrated a complete, devastating family syndicate, united in their singular, malicious goal to strip me of everything I had built from nothing. Darius ripped his designer glasses from his face, tossing them onto the desk with a sharp, angry clatter. He looked at me with absolute professional fury, completely horrified by the massive scale of the theft and the brazen forgery of my legal signature. He immediately reached for his heavy desk phone, his voice hard, urgent, and commanding. He told me we were calling the Atlanta Police Department Fraud Division right this very second. He stated unequivocally that we had concrete, indisputable evidence of grand larceny, identity theft, and massive wire fraud. He insisted that we could easily have Julian arrested and locked up by nightfall, immediately freezing the Delaware accounts long before Tasha and Beverly could manage to move a single stolen cent offshore into untraceable international banks. I reached aggressively across the wide expanse of the desk and slammed my hand violently down on the receiver, cutting the dial tone dead in an instant. Darius stared at me in wide-eyed shock, demanding to know what on earth I was doing. I stared right back at him, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm whisper, and told him no. I absolutely refused to call the police. I refused to let uniformed officers march into my pristine home and loudly drag my husband out in handcuffs for the entire affluent neighborhood to witness. Darius argued fiercely, reminding me that Julian was a dangerous criminal who had poisoned me and stolen millions of dollars. He told me repeatedly that calling the authorities was the only logical, legally sound step to safely recover my stolen capital. I shook my head, my jaw clenched so incredibly tight my teeth physically ached. Calling the police meant forcibly opening the floodgates to a massive, highly public, utterly humiliating legal battle. It meant invasive search warrants, public depositions, and leaked court documents plastered everywhere. It meant the hungry media would inevitably get hold of the story. I knew exactly how Beverly operated. She was a master manipulator of societal narratives and public perception. If I pressed criminal charges, she would immediately hire an aggressive crisis management team. She would spin a vicious, highly tearful story to the Atlanta elite, falsely claiming I was a bitter, vindictively cruel wife, trying to ruthlessly destroy her innocent son, over a simple marital financial misunderstanding. She would drag my hard-earned name through the absolute mud, expertly casting herself and her children as the pure innocent victims of my ruthless corporate aggression. Darius rubbed his temples, letting out a heavy, frustrated sigh that filled the quiet, tense room. He leaned back slowly in his plush leather chair, locking his intense gaze directly with mine. He forcefully reminded me of exactly who I was and how incredibly hard I had fought to secure my powerful position. He recounted the brutal, exhausting uphill battle I had waged to establish my development firm as a black woman in a cutthroat, predominantly white male-dominated commercial real estate industry. I had spent an entire decade viciously fighting for a seat at the table, forcing wealthy investors to take my ambitious blueprint seriously, securing massive funding through sheer, undeniable brilliance and unyielding determination. I had successfully cultivated a pristine, absolutely bulletproof reputation in Atlanta as a serious developer who executed flawless urban projects with zero drama and absolute total reliability. A highly publicized, messy domestic fraud scandal would instantly shatter that carefully constructed armor into a million tiny pieces. The old money investors and highly conservative banking executives who consistently funded my massive urban revitalization projects absolutely detested any form of public controversy. If I became the tragic poster child for a sensationalized, trashy family fraud case, my professional leverage would evaporate overnight. They would suddenly see me as a massive liability, a weak woman completely incapable of managing her own household, let alone multi-million-dollar commercial development contracts. My hard-earned reputation would be completely, permanently eclipsed by the deeply humiliating narrative of a wife who foolishly let her husband drug her and drain her bank accounts dry. I simply could not survive a public victim narrative. To maintain my growing empire, I had to remain an untouchable powerhouse completely insulated from the messy, deeply embarrassing public scandal my husband had thoughtlessly created. I stood up, outlining a devastating alternative. I did not just want my money back. I wanted to permanently trap them in a federal financial crime from which they could simply never legally hope to escape. The drive back to my estate in Sandy Springs was an exercise in pure adrenaline management. I navigated the dense morning traffic with the precision of a ghost slipping through the shadows. My mind was a hyperactive command center processing every variable of the trap Darius and I had just finalized. I turned onto my street, killing the headlights of the decoy sedan a full block away. I coasted silently into the hidden service bay at the rear of the property. The house above me was a sprawling monument to my success, and currently a nest of vipers waiting for me to bleed out. I moved through the service corridor, relying entirely on muscle memory to avoid the floorboards I knew would creak. I slipped the burner phone into a specialized hollowed-out cavity behind the laundry room baseboard. I stripped off my dark athletic gear, shoving it deep into the bottom of a laundry hamper beneath a pile of heavy winter coats. I pulled my lightweight silk pajamas back on, feeling the cool fabric slide against my skin. The lingering effects of whatever sedative Beverly had laced my tea with fought against the raw fury pumping through my veins, making my limbs feel heavy and uncoordinated. I embraced that physical weakness. I needed it to sell the performance of a lifetime. I crept back into the master's suite, gently pulling the heavy oak door shut until the latch clicked with a barely audible snap. I scrambled beneath the plush duvet, pulling the heavy covers up to my chin. I tossed my hair across the pillows, ensuring it looked sufficiently damp and disheveled. I closed my eyes and forced my breathing into a shallow, ragged rhythm. Seconds later, the master bedroom door swung open. The sharp click of designer heels against the hardwood floor announced Tasha's arrival. She strutted into the room, carrying a heavy leather clipboard pressed against her chest. I kept my eyes closed for a moment, letting out a low, pained groan. When I finally fluttered my eyelids open, I squinted against the dim, ambient light filtering in from the hallway. Tasha was hovering over me, wearing a sickeningly sweet smile that did absolutely nothing to hide the malicious triumph dancing in her eyes. She wore a pristine white cashmere sweater and perfectly tailored slacks, looking like a woman preparing for a victory parade rather than tending to a sick relative. Her heavy gold bracelets clinked together like a warning bell as she rested her hand gently on the edge of my mattress. She leaned in close, her expensive floral perfume clashing violently with the sterile smell of the hospital-grade hydration fluids they had forced upon me. She spoke in a soft, hushed tone that dripped with fake maternal concern. "Kiara, sweetie, how are you feeling this morning?" she asked, her voice laced with an artificial honey that made my skin crawl. I forced a wet cough, pulling the duvet tighter around my trembling shoulders. "I feel terrible, Tasha. My head is splitting open and the nausea is coming back in waves." I let my voice crack intentionally, allowing a note of pure, desperate exhaustion to bleed through. Tasha's smile widened just a fraction of an inch, her ego visibly swelling at the sight of my absolute vulnerability. She truly believed she was standing over the conquered queen of Atlanta real estate. She reached forward and gently brushed a stray lock of hair away from my forehead. Her touch was icy and entirely devoid of human empathy. "I know it hurts, sweetie, but Beverly made some fresh broth for you downstairs, and Julian is on a very important conference call. He asked me to bring you these papers before you go back to sleep. It is just some boring medical release forms, and the hospital insurance claims they need authorized today." She lifted the heavy leather clipboard and placed it gently on my lap. The documents were meticulously arranged. A simple hospital release form was placed securely on top, acting as the perfect innocent decoy. But I knew exactly what lay beneath that carefully curated cover sheet. Hidden beneath the medical jargon were the LLC transfer authorizations, the holding company release forms, and the devastating power of attorney that would legally empower Julian to strip me of everything I owned. Tasha retrieved a sleek gold pen from her pocket and clicked it open, offering it to me with a delicate flourish. "They just need your signature on the flagged pages, sweetie, and then you can go right back to sleep and focus entirely on getting your strength back." The sheer audacity of her lie was a masterclass in sociopathic behavior. She was staring me right in the face, pretending to care for my health, while literally handing me the instrument of my own financial execution. I knew I had to escalate the performance. I needed her to feel so completely dominant that she would never suspect a single thing. I let out a sharp sob, letting real tears pool in the corners of my eyes and spill hot and fast down my cheeks. My hands shook violently as I reached up to take the gold pen from her grasp. I fumbled it intentionally, letting it clatter against the clipboard. "I am so sorry, Tasha." I whimpered, my voice breaking into a pathetic, breathless cry. "I just feel so incredibly weak. I cannot even hold the pen straight. My brain feels like it is on fire." I covered my face with my trembling hands, letting my shoulders heave with manufactured despair. Tasha sighed, a soft, condescending sound that revealed the deep well of contempt she held for me. She sat down on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under her weight. She placed her hand over mine, guiding my fingers back to the gold pen. "It is okay, Kiara," she murmured, her voice dropping its sweet facade just enough to reveal the cold, hard steel underneath. "You do not need to think about anything right now. Julian is handling all the heavy lifting. He always knows exactly what to do. Just sign where the sticky notes are, and we will take care of the rest. You have worked so hard for so long. It is finally time for you to just let go and let us manage things for a while." Her words were a chilling double entendre, a verbal twisting of the knife she was preparing to plunge into my back. She wanted me to let go of my empire, my money, and my power. She was relishing every single second of my perceived surrender. I sniffled, wiping my tear-stained face with the back of my hand. I nodded weakly, offering her a look of complete, pathetic gratitude. "Thank you, Tasha," I whispered. "Thank you all for taking such good care of me." I gripped the pen and lowered the tip to the first flagged signature line. As I stared down at the crisp white paper, a profound sense of cold clarity washed over my mind. Tasha and Julian believed they had orchestrated the perfect crime, but they had profoundly underestimated my vigilance. They had no idea that I had caught the scent of Julian's financial desperation over 6 months ago. It started with a minor discrepancy on a secondary escrow account, a small, unauthorized inquiry that Julian had quickly brushed off as a banking error. But I did not build a commercial real estate empire by ignoring minor discrepancies. I immediately went to Darius. We spent weeks conducting a covert forensic audit of Julian's hidden activities, uncovering the terrifying depths of his gambling addiction and his secret high-risk margin accounts. I knew it was only a matter of time before he became desperate enough to make a play for my primary assets. Darius and I had spent an entire weekend meticulously architecting a brilliant invisible defense mechanism. We legally established a highly specific cryptographic signature completely distinct from my standard legal signature. We registered this specific variation with my banks, my private wealth managers, and the federal fraud authorities. My real signature was fluid with a sharp dramatic loop on the K and a long sweeping tail on the A. The decoy signature we engineered looked virtually identical to the untrained eye, but contained tiny deliberate structural variations. The loop on the K was intentionally broken. The slant of the letters was altered by exactly 15 degrees, and I added a microscopic distinct dot directly beneath the final letter. To anyone else, including my treacherous husband, it looked exactly like my hurried, sloppy handwriting. But to the banking institutions, and to Darius, that specific signature was a massive blaring red siren. We had legally codified that if this specific cryptographic signature ever appeared on any legal document, any wire transfer, or any LLC authorization, it immediately rendered the document completely legally void. Furthermore, it functioned as a silent alarm. The moment any institution scanned or processed a document bearing that exact signature, it would trigger an automatic immediate federal fraud alert directly on Darius's secure terminal. It was a poison pill seamlessly integrated into my own handwriting. I took a shallow, shaky breath, maintaining my facade of extreme physical weakness. I pressed the gold pen against the paper and executed the decoy signature flawlessly. I broke the loop, I altered the slant, I added the microscopic dot. I flipped to the next flagged page, my hand trembling theatrically as I signed away the rights to my holding company using the exact same voided signature. I moved through the thick stack of documents, crying softly, making sure Tasha saw my tears splashing directly onto the paperwork. I signed the LLC transfers. I signed the Delaware Shell Company authorizations. I signed the devastating power of attorney that Julian planned to use to steal my house. With every stroke of the pen, I was not handing them my empire. I was handing them the rope they would use to hang themselves. I was locking them into a documented, premeditated federal crime of astronomical proportions. When I reached the final page, I let the pen slip from my exhausted fingers and fall onto the duvet. I slumped back against the heavy pillows, closing my eyes and letting out a long, weary sigh. "Is that all of them, Tasha?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Tasha eagerly snatched the heavy leather clipboard off my lap, her eyes darting greedily over the wet ink of my signatures. Her sickeningly sweet smile returned, burning brighter and more triumphant than ever before. "Yes, sweetie," she chirped, her voice practically vibrating with barely contained euphoria. "That is all of them. You did perfectly. Now you just rest. We have absolutely everything under control." She turned on her heel and practically skipped out of the master suite, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her. The sharp sound of her designer heels echoed down the hallway, moving rapidly toward the staircase where I knew Julian and Beverly were anxiously waiting to claim their stolen kingdom. I lay perfectly still, listening until the sound of her footsteps faded entirely into the cavernous silence of the house. The moment the ambient noise vanished, the fragile, broken woman in the bed disappeared. I opened my eyes, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. I reached up with a steady, unshakable hand and calmly wiped the remaining fake tears from my cheeks. My expression hardened, turning ice cold and razor sharp. The fear and the weakness evaporated completely, replaced by a ruthless, predatory focus. The bait had been taken. The trap had snapped shut. They thought they had won the war, but they had just signed their own federal indictments. Now it was my turn to destroy them. The next 48 hours transformed my Sandy Springs estate into a theater of the absurd. I played my role to perfection, maintaining the fragile illusion of an exhausted woman clawing her way back to baseline health. I spent daylight hours resting against the plush pillows of the master suite, occasionally shuffling down to the kitchen in my silk robe to pour water. Beverly and Tasha abandoned their charade of maternal concern, believing they had secured the $4.5 million in their Delaware shell company. Their behavior mutated from cautious manipulation into brazen arrogance. They stopped lowering their voices when discussing extravagant plans. The mahogany hallways echoed with sharp sounds of their triumphant laughter and the constant chiming of the doorbell. Luxury couriers became a permanent fixture on my driveway. Massive cardboard boxes stamped with logos of elite European fashion houses piled up in the foyer. Tasha strutted around the living area, showcasing diamond tennis bracelets and exotic leather handbags that cost more than most earned in a fiscal year. They were rapidly burning through the capital I sacrificed years to accumulate. I remained an invisible ghost in my home, observing their sickening victory parade from the carpeted landing of the second floor. The acoustics of the vaulted ceiling carried their every word directly to my hidden vantage point. On Thursday afternoon, I sat perfectly still in the shadows, listening to Beverly pace the marble floor below. She held a crystal glass of sparkling water in one hand and her phone pressed tightly to her ear. Her voice was sharp, commanding, and dripping with the haughty entitlement of a woman who believed she had finally arrived. She was speaking directly to the senior event coordinator at the St. Regis Hotel. I held my breath, absorbing every single detail of her grandiose conversation. Beverly was not just planning a simple celebration party, she was aggressively organizing the most exclusive charity gala of the entire Atlanta season, specifically targeting the city's affluent Black elite. She barked orders into the phone, demanding the absolute best. I listened in utter disgust as she casually authorized a $100,000 non-refundable deposit for the grand ballroom. She loudly rejected the standard catering options, demanding a customized culinary experience featuring imported beluga caviar and Wagyu beef. She commanded the coordinator to secure 50 cases of rare vintage French champagne, refusing to accept domestic substitutions. She ordered massive, towering centerpieces, constructed entirely of rare orchids flown in directly from Holland. She was dropping hundreds of thousands of dollars on a single night of performative philanthropy. But the gala was not merely a vain attempt to climb the social ladder. It was a calculated strategic debut. Beverly ended the phone call and turned to Tasha, who was lounging lazily on the custom velvet sofa, scrolling through her phone. Beverly clapped her hands together, her eyes gleaming with predatory ambition. She laid out the true master plan for the upcoming evening. Beverly intended to use the lavish charity gala to formally introduce Tasha to the highest echelons of Atlanta society. She was systematically buying Tasha a prominent seat at the table, populating the guest list with the city's most powerful commercial real estate developers, elite banking executives, and wealthy private investors. Beverly planned to take the stage during the prime dinner service and publicly announce Tasha as a brilliant visionary real estate investor. The sheer delusion of her plan made my stomach churn. Tasha was a woman whose own fashion brand was currently drowning in massive vendor lawsuits and impending bankruptcy filings. She had never negotiated a commercial lease, managed a construction crew, or closed a property acquisition in her entire life. Yet Beverly was going to parade her around the grand ballroom, presenting her as a self-made mogul. They were actively using my stolen money, my blood and sweat to finance a spectacular lie. They planned to hijack my professional identity, stealing the prestige I had bled to earn and pasting it onto Tasha's empty resume. I gripped the wooden banisters so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. The searing rage burning inside my chest threatened to break through my carefully constructed calm facade, but I forced it back down. I locked the fury away deep inside my core, transmuting the emotional pain into a calculated desire for absolute total annihilation. I quietly backed away from the railing and slipped into the master bathroom, turning on the cold water faucet and splashing my face until my pulse finally steadied. Later that evening, the heavy oak front door swung open, signaling Julian's return from his wealth management firm. I quickly climbed back into bed, pulling the heavy duvet up to my chest and adopting a soft, weary expression. When Julian walked into the master suite, the aggressive swagger of a successful corporate director was missing. Instead, he carried a suffocating, pathetic aura of marital guilt. He approached the bed holding a cheap plastic-wrapped bouquet of wilted grocery store carnations. It was a laughable, pitiful gesture from a man who had just orchestrated the theft of millions. He placed the flowers gently on the bedside nightstand with a heavy, dramatic sigh. He leaned over and kissed my forehead, his lips feeling like ice against my skin. He played the role of the devoted, worried husband flawlessly. He asked how his beautiful wife was feeling today, his voice dripping with forced syrupy affection. He told me he hated seeing me so weak and promised he was taking care of absolutely everything so I could simply rest. He sat on the edge of the mattress holding my hand and tracing circles on my palm. He had no idea that I knew everything. He was completely unaware that I had spent the afternoon listening to his mother use my life's work to fund a monumentally tacky vanity project. He smiled at me, projecting total safety, entirely oblivious to the federal trap closing tight around his own throat. I returned his smile, squeezing his fingers weakly. I thanked him for the beautiful flowers, keeping my voice perfectly steady. I told him I felt incredibly lucky to have a husband who stepped up to manage the heavy burdens when I could not. The lie tasted like ash in my mouth, but I swallowed it down, maintaining unyielding eye contact. Friday morning arrived with a sudden convenient disruption to Julian's meticulously planned schedule. I sat up in bed, sipping a cup of hot tea while Julian stood by his expansive custom walk-in closet, hastily throwing tailored suits and crisp white shirts into his expensive leather overnight bag. He pulled his silk tie tight, adjusting it nervously in the full-length mirror. He turned to face me, adopting a mask of extreme professional burden. He let out a long, heavy sigh, scrubbing a hand across his jawline. He announced with a perfectly practiced tone of deep regret that he had to fly out immediately for a last-minute wealth management conference in Chicago. He claimed a major institutional client was threatening to pull their massive portfolio, and the situation required his immediate personal intervention to salvage the firm's relationship. He apologized profusely for leaving me while I was still recovering, swearing he would catch the earliest possible flight back on Sunday morning. I smiled warmly, offering him my complete and total understanding. I pushed the duvet aside, stepping out of bed to help him fold his remaining silk ties and pack his leather shaving kit. I told him not to worry about me for a single second, reminding him that Beverly and Tasha were downstairs to handle anything I might possibly need. I kissed his cheek, wishing him a successful trip and a safe flight. He grabbed his briefcase and hurried out the door, calling out a quick goodbye to his mother. The moment the heavy front door clicked shut and the deadbolt engaged, my warm smile vanished instantly. I walked to the bedroom window, pulling the curtain back a fraction of an inch. I watched Julian's luxury sedan reverse out of the driveway and speed down the street, disappearing into the neighborhood. I did not move until the sound of his engine was swallowed by ambient noise. I turned away, moving with swift precision. I reached behind the false panel near the floorboards and pulled out my encrypted burner laptop. I booted up the machine, connecting to my hidden secondary wireless network. I bypassed standard security protocols and opened a specialized tracking software interface. A detailed digital map of the greater Atlanta area populated the screen. I watched a small red dot moving steadily along the interstate, tracking the exact real-time location of the microscopic GPS device I planted deep inside the wheel well of his sedan weeks ago. The blinking red pixel on my encrypted screen did not veer south toward the massive sprawling complex of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. It bypassed the major highway interchanges, completely taking a sharp, calculated turn directly into the wealthiest high-end shopping district in the city. I sat forward, the cold leather of the desk chair pressing against my bare legs, watching the GPS tracker map his exact movements through the bustling Friday morning traffic of Buckhead. He was not rushing to catch a first-class flight to Chicago. He was not panicking over a massive institutional client threatening to pull their portfolio. He was cruising leisurely down Peachtree Road, avoiding the morning rush hour with the ease of a man who had not a single care in the world. The red dot finally slowed to a crawl, pulling into a massive, sprawling commercial lot before coming to a complete and total stop. I zoomed in on the digital map, dropping a satellite pin on the exact coordinates. The address belonged to the most exclusive exotic car dealership in the entire metropolitan Atlanta area, a place that catered strictly to athletes, entertainers, and the outrageously wealthy. I closed the laptop, sliding it back into its hidden compartment behind the baseboard. The lingering grogginess of the sedative Beverly had pumped into my system was entirely gone, burned away by the sheer white-hot adrenaline surging through my veins. I moved with swift, silent precision. I changed out of my silk pajamas, throwing on dark denim, a nondescript black athletic sweater, and my oversized dark sunglasses. I pulled my baseball cap down low over my forehead. I crept back down the service staircase, slipping out the rear door and sliding into the rough construction sedan I had used the day before. I merged into the heavy Atlanta traffic, keeping a safe, untraceable distance from Julian's pinned location. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, the leather creaked under my knuckles. Within 20 minutes, I was pulling into a crowded strip mall parking lot directly across the broad street from the dealership. I killed the engine, slumping down slightly in the worn driver's seat, and rolled the tinted window down just enough to get a clear, unobstructed view of the massive showroom floor. The dealership was a breathtaking monument to excessive wealth, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling glass panes that showcased rows of gleaming imported machinery. And right there, standing dead center in the immaculate, brightly lit showroom, was my husband. He was not dressed like a man preparing for intense, high-stakes corporate negotiations. He had stripped off his tailored suit jacket, tossing it carelessly onto a plush leather lounge chair. He was laughing uproariously, his head thrown back, clapping a slick-looking salesman on the shoulder. They were standing next to a brand-new custom-ordered Porsche. The vehicle was a masterpiece of aggressive German engineering, painted a deep, shimmering metallic gray with striking red brake calipers and a pristine ivory interior. It was the kind of vehicle that commanded attention on the street, carrying a price tag well over $200,000. I watched with morbid fascination as Julian ran his hand lovingly over the sleek aerodynamic hood of the sports car. He leaned in, inspecting the hand-stitched leather steering wheel with the awe of a child on Christmas morning. He looked happier, more vibrant, and more arrogant than I had seen him in years. He was practically vibrating with a sickening euphoria. A hostess in a sharp black suit brought him a crystal flute of sparkling water on a silver tray. He took a sip before pulling a sleek black leather folder out of his briefcase and confidently began signing the purchase agreements right there on the hood of the car. He was gleefully committing grand larceny, using the liquid assets I had bled to secure to buy himself the ultimate status symbol. As I watched him sign those papers, laughing with the salesman, a profound fundamental shift occurred deep within my soul. Up until this exact second, a tiny, foolish fraction of my heart had still been mourning the man I thought I married. A microscopic part of me had wondered if perhaps his terrible gambling addiction had genuinely driven him to a point of temporary, desperate insanity. I had briefly questioned if trapping him in a federal crime was too ruthless, too vindictive for the vows we had taken before God and our families. But watching him celebrate his theft completely erased any lingering hesitation I had left in my body. The compassion died instantly. He was not a desperate man, drowning in debt, making a terrible, panicked mistake. He was a calculated, remorseless predator. He had watched me lie in bed, supposedly sick and fragile, and he had used that manufactured vulnerability to drain my accounts so he could buy a luxury toy. He was funding his family's vanity gala and his own exotic car collection with the blood, sweat, and tears of my decade-long grind. The man I loved was completely dead. Only a parasite remained, and I was going to exterminate him without a single ounce of mercy. I picked up my encrypted burner phone and dialed Darius's private secure line. He answered on the first ring, his voice crisp and strictly professional. I did not bother with pleasantries. I kept my eyes locked on Julian as he shook the salesman's hand in triumphant agreement. "I am parked across the street from an exotic auto dealership in Buckhead," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. "Julian is currently purchasing a $200,000 Porsche. He is not in Chicago. He is liquidating the stolen capital right this very second. Spring the trap, Darius. Execute the structural pivot right now." I heard the sharp, rapid clicking of a mechanical keyboard on the other end of the line, followed by a heavy exhale. Darius let out a low whistle of absolute disbelief. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of this man. Darius muttered, the sound of his furious typing echoing loudly through the receiver. I am initiating the back-end protocol right now, Kiara. Give me authorization to execute the master override. I gave him the verbal confirmation watching the salesman hand Julian a sleek silver presentation box containing the keys. Darius was a legal architect of unparalleled brilliance. Years ago, when my commercial development firm first began securing massive municipal contracts, I had insisted on building an impenetrable financial fortress. I had quietly maintained a master holding company, positioned securely like an invisible iron umbrella over all of my targeted accounts. It was a corporate Russian doll structure. Julian and Tasha believed they were successfully siphoning funds from independent vulnerable business accounts. They had absolutely no idea that every single one of those accounts was legally tethered to a supreme corporate entity that only I controlled. Darius was now executing a massive structural pivot in the digital background. By bypassing the forged authorizations Julian had submitted, Darius triggered the master holding company's emergency protocols. He began rapidly rerouting the back-end routing numbers for every single cent Julian thought he had successfully transferred into the Delaware shell company. I am swapping out the corrupted internal ledgers, Darius announced, his voice tight with extreme concentration. I am pulling up the digital archives now. There is a file you can reference named duyen1_23.docx that Julian used to mask the initial massive wire transfer out of your primary operational fund. I am voiding it completely. He typed furiously, his breathing audible over the line. I am also identifying the secondary holding contracts. There is a file you can reference named duyen3_23.docx that contains Tasha's fraudulent executive signatures authorizing the shell company formation. I am overriding it with the master holding injunction right now. Keep going. I ordered, watching Julian slide effortlessly into the luxurious driver's seat of the Porsche. I am accessing the fake board of director approvals. Darius continued his pace, reaching a frantic rhythm. There is a file you can reference named duyen4_23.docx, explicitly linking Beverly to the signatory accounts, making her the primary financial beneficiary. I am wiping its routing protocol from the central banking ledger. Finally, I am destroying the initial fake power of attorney draft. There is a file you can reference named duyen2_23.docx that they tried to use as the foundation of this entire massive theft. It is neutralized, Kiara. I have completely rerouted the back-end financial architecture. The money is locked. The absolute genius of Darius's maneuver was its silent, devastating lethality. Julian and Tasha's Delaware shell company still appeared perfectly normal on the surface. If they checked their banking app right now from their phones, the stolen $4.5 million would still appear as pending available funds on their digital screens. The illusion of wealth was perfectly maintained. But the underlying plumbing of the accounts had been entirely severed and reattached to a massive, inescapable trap. Darius had irrevocably tethered their fraudulent shell company to a new, highly classified legal entity managed directly by the Federal Fraud Division. I sat in the cold, quiet interior of my rough sedan, watching Julian slowly drive the gleaming gray Porsche out of the dealership lot, the heavy imported engine purring with aggressive power. The sunlight caught the polished rims as he pulled out onto Peachtree Road, a smug, satisfied smile plastered across his face. He was completely and utterly unaware that he was driving a stolen vehicle straight into a legal slaughterhouse. The trap was perfectly set, and the vault was permanently locked. When the banking institutions officially opened their heavy doors on Monday morning, the money would absolutely not belong to Tasha. It would not fund Beverly's ridiculous elite Atlanta gala. It would belong entirely to the federal government, and my husband was going to spend the rest of his natural life trapped in a concrete cage. I watched the silver Porsche disappear into the Atlanta traffic, carrying my husband toward his spectacular ruin. I put the rough sedan in gear and merged onto Peachtree Road, heading in the opposite direction. I did not go home. I drove straight back to the towering glass high-rise in Midtown where Darius was waiting. The federal trap was set, but freezing the funds was only the first half of my master plan. Simply stopping the theft was not enough. I wanted them decimated. I wanted them legally bound to a financial nightmare so complex and devastating that no bankruptcy lawyer in the country could untangle them from it. I walked into his dimly lit office. The wall monitor was still glowing with the complex webs of our routed accounts. Darius was leaning back in his leather chair, a rare, genuine smile playing on his face. He had a stack of crisp legal documents waiting on his polished mahogany desk. He pointed to the top page detailing the final destination of the $4.5 million. I did not want the money to sit in a federal holding account while lawyers debated its rightful owner for years. I wanted it transformed into a weapon. Months ago, when I first suspected Julian's financial treachery, I had Darius draft a highly specific, completely bulletproof legal entity. It was an irrevocable charitable trust specifically dedicated to a coalition of historically Black colleges and universities. Beverly was so desperately obsessed with buying her way into Atlanta's Black elite using my money to fund a flashy, empty gala. I decided to take that exact same money and use it to fund real, tangible Black excellence. The trust was designed to provide full-ride scholarships for brilliant underprivileged students pursuing degrees in structural engineering and commercial architecture. It was the ultimate poetic justice. My stolen life's work would permanently empower the next generation of builders while destroying the parasites trying to tear me down. The genius of the trap lay in its absolute irreversibility. By legally defining the trust as irrevocable, the moment funds crossed its digital threshold, they could never be pulled back under any circumstances. Not by me, not by Julian, not by a judge. The money was permanently legally gone. I stood beside Darius, staring at the glowing monitor as he explained the brilliant mechanics of the execution. When Julian and Tasha forged my signature on those LLC transfer authorizations, they thought they were simply moving cash into their private Delaware shell company. They failed to read the microscopic fine print hidden deep within the holding company release forms. Because they used the specific decoy signature, the cryptographic poison pill we had engineered, the transaction did not just flag the federal authorities, it automatically executed a secondary smart contract we had embedded in the banking software. By forging my name to move the money, Julian and Tasha unknowingly legally authorized a massive philanthropic donation. They did not steal $4.5 million into their own pockets. They legally bound their new Delaware shell company to donate $4.5 million directly to my HBCU trust. I looked at the corporate registry displayed on the screen. Tasha was listed as the sole executive officer of that shell company. Beverly was the primary board member and sole financial signatory. They had structured it that way to completely insulate Julian from the theft. Their greed had perfectly isolated them as the sole responsible parties. The smart contract was currently processing the donation under Tasha's corporate entity. She was about to become the most generous philanthropist in the state of Georgia completely against her will. Darius clicked his pen against the desk, highlighting the absolute beauty of the legal checkmate we had engineered. When the banking institutions processed the final clearing protocols on Monday morning, Julian and Tasha would log into their accounts expecting to see a fortune. Instead, they would find a zero balance and a digitally certified receipt thanking them for their monumental charitable contribution. Their panic would be instantaneous and catastrophic, but their options were completely non-existent. They were trapped in an inescapable legal paradox. If Julian and Tasha panicked and attempted to reverse the transfer, they would hit a titanium wall. To stop an irrevocable trust donation, they would have to legally prove that the transfer was unauthorized. To prove it was unauthorized, they would have to march directly into a federal building, look an FBI agent in the eye, and officially confess that they forged my signature to commit massive wire fraud and grand larceny. They would have to admit to stealing millions of dollars to halt the donation. The moment they opened their mouths to complain, they would be handing themselves federal prison sentences. But the alternative was even more devastating. If they chose to remain silent to protect themselves from prison, the money was permanently given away. They would not get a single dime. And the absolute best part, the devastating coup de grace involved the Internal Revenue Service. Because Tasha's shell company had legally authorized the transfer as a gift rather than a business expense, they had just triggered a catastrophic tax event. You cannot simply give away $4.5 million without the government demanding its share. Tasha and Beverly were about to owe the IRS millions of dollars in massive gift taxes. They would owe cash they did not possess for money they no longer had. The IRS does not care about family drama or forged signatures unless you confess to a crime. They only care about the tax liability attached to the registered entity. Tasha and Beverly would have their personal bank accounts seized, their wages permanently garnished, and whatever fake luxury assets they possessed completely liquidated by federal tax collectors. They thought they were stealing my empire, but I had just turned them into permanent indentured servants to the United States government. I watched the digital progress bar on Darius's screen slowly inch toward completion. Every pixel represented another layer of their destruction. The sheer audacity of Beverly planning a $100,000 gala to announce Tasha as a visionary investor was laughable now. They had envisioned a grand debut into Atlanta high society entirely funded by my sweat and brilliance. They were going to order imported champagne and rent the most exclusive ballroom in the city to celebrate a theft they thought was foolproof. Instead, they were actively financing the educational futures of hundreds of deserving students. The irony was so rich and potent, I could practically taste it. Julian's grand joyride in his new Porsche was equally doomed. He had gleefully signed the paperwork for a $200,000 luxury vehicle, believing his secret Delaware accounts were overflowing with my liquidated assets. He had probably used those exact fraudulent accounts to secure the financing or write the initial down payment check. When the dealership attempted to process that transaction next week, it would bounce spectacularly. His shiny new toy would be violently repossessed, and the resulting financial inquiries would expose his massive hidden debts to the world. His carefully curated image as a highly successful wealth management director would evaporate instantly, leaving behind the pathetic reality of a desperate thieving addict. Darius leaned forward and typed a final sequence of commands into his secure terminal. The screen flashed a brilliant emerald green displaying a final digital confirmation seal. The funds had completely cleared the holding phase and were officially legally locked inside the irrevocable charitable trust. There was no turning back. The master override was permanent. "We did it," Darius said, his voice thick with a mixture of professional awe and deep personal satisfaction. "The money is entirely secure. The trust is fully funded and legally impenetrable. By Monday morning, the scholarship board will be notified of the anonymous $4.5 million endowment granted by Tasha and Beverly's shell company. You just changed hundreds of lives, Kiara." I smiled, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace settle over my tired bones. I had spent the last decade viciously fighting for a seat at the table, forcing wealthy investors to take my ambitious blueprints seriously, and securing massive funding through sheer, undeniable brilliance. I had built an untouchable powerhouse reputation. Julian, Beverly, and Tasha had tried to strip me of that armor, reducing me to a tragic victim. But I refused to play the role they assigned me. I was not a fragile, sick woman waiting to be robbed. I was the architect of their absolute ruin. I thanked Darius, shaking his hand with immense gratitude before gathering my things and leaving the high-rise. I drove back to Sandy Springs, the fading afternoon light casting long dramatic shadows across the affluent neighborhood. The house was quiet when I slipped back through the service corridor and returned to the master suite. The weekend stretched out before me, a calm, quiet waiting period before the storm hit. The Delaware shell company that Julian and Tasha control is now irrevocably tethered to a new entity. When the bank opens on Monday, the money will not belong to Tasha. It will belong to the federal government. The 48 hours between Darius sealing the irrevocable trust and the St. Regis Gala felt like the heavy, suffocating silence before a catastrophic hurricane. I spent Saturday moving through my Sandy Springs estate like a phantom, completing the final preparations for my resurrection. For months, I had played the role of the frail, deteriorating wife, I had practiced the weak smiles, the slow shuffling walks, the exhausted sighs. I had allowed Julian to play the devoted caretaker while he secretly plotted my financial execution. Tonight, that performance was officially cancelled. I sat before the expansive vanity mirror in the master suite staring at my reflection. I reached for a makeup wipe and methodically erased the pale powder I had been using to feign illness. I watched the natural warmth and color return to my skin. I brushed out my hair until it cascaded in thick, dark, voluminous waves down my back. I applied a sharp, aggressive contour and a bold, blood-red lip color. There was no trace of the victim left in my eyes, only the cold, calculating stare of a woman who was about to burn her enemies to the ground. The gown hung on the back of the heavy oak door waiting for me. I had purchased it specifically for this night. It was a masterpiece of structural couture tailored to fit every single curve with lethal precision. The fabric was a rich, deep crimson silk that moved like liquid fire when the light caught it. It featured a plunging neckline, structured shoulders, and a dramatic sweeping train that demanded absolute attention. It was not just a dress, it was armor. I slipped it on, feeling the heavy, luxurious material drape against my skin. I secured a vintage diamond choker around my neck, a genuine heirloom piece that radiated old money and authentic power. I stepped into a pair of towering black stiletto heels. I was the architect of their destruction, and it was time to survey the demolition. I drove myself to the St. Regis Hotel, moving seamlessly through the humid Atlanta evening. When I handed my keys to the valet, the young man visibly swallowed hard, taking in the imposing figure I presented. I walked through the gilded lobby, my heels clicking with a steady, rhythmic cadence against the polished floors. The grand ballroom was a masterclass in stolen opulence. Beverly had spared absolutely no expense burning through the initial fraudulent deposit money with reckless abandon. Through the slightly parted doors, I could see the towering centerpieces of rare white orchids imported directly from Holland, dominating every crystal-draped table. Massive ice sculptures catching the glow of the massive crystal chandeliers anchored the corners of the room. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the soft melodic sounds of a live jazz quartet playing in the background. Waitstaff in crisp white uniforms circulated continuously, carrying silver platters piled high with beluga caviar and perfectly seared Wagyu beef. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with the absolute zenith of Atlanta society. Mayors, city council members, commercial real estate tycoons, and Silicon Valley tech moguls mingled freely. It was exactly the kind of high society debut Beverly had salivated over for decades. She had populated the guest list with the city's most powerful decision-makers, specifically to establish her own dominance using my stolen capital as her entry ticket. I stood in the shadowed alcove just outside the main doors, watching them revel in their imaginary victory. In the center of the room, Beverly and Tasha were holding court beneath the largest chandelier. They were dripping in brand-new diamonds, their necks and wrists throwing fractured rainbows of light across the walls. Beverly wore an extravagant emerald green evening gown that screamed new money. She was laughing loudly, gripping the arm of a prominent private investor and working the room with a predatory hunger. She was actively introducing Tasha to everyone who possessed a seven-figure portfolio. Tasha looked entirely out of her depth, draped in an overly embellished silver gown that looked cheap despite its staggering price tag. She masked her sheer incompetence with arrogant smirks and rehearsed corporate buzzwords. I watched her nod sagely as a banking executive spoke to her, playing the role of the brilliant visionary real estate investor to absolute perfection. They were literally wearing my blood and sweat, parading it around a room full of strangers. Across the ballroom, standing by the polished mahogany bar, was Julian. He was flanked by two prominent commercial developers, looking every inch the conquering corporate king. He wore a custom-tailored velvet tuxedo, swirling a flute of vintage French champagne in his hand. He projected an aura of absolute invincibility, holding his audience captive with some charming anecdote. He looked happier and more relaxed than I had seen him in years. He was completely convinced his future was secured. His newly purchased Porsche was safely parked in the VIP lot, and his brilliant wife was tucked away in bed, oblivious to his ultimate betrayal. The heavy double mahogany doors at the rear of the ballroom were guarded by 2 hotel security staff. I stepped out of the shadows, my crimson gown sweeping silently across the thick carpeted hallway. The guards immediately moved to intercept me, raising their hands to ask for my invitation. I did not slow my pace. I fixed them with a single sharp, icy glare that possessed the absolute authority of a woman who owned the building. They hesitated, dropping their hands and stepping back instantly. I placed my hands flat against the polished wood of the heavy doors and pushed. The doors swung inward with a heavy, dramatic thud that echoed sharply over the soft jazz. I stepped over the threshold into the brilliant light of the ballroom. The crimson silk of my gown caught the chandelier light, burning like a brilliant flare against the sea of black tuxedos and muted evening wear. I stood perfectly straight, my shoulders back, my chin raised, radiating absolute health and terrifying power. The transformation was complete. The sick wife was dead, and the Crimson Queen had arrived to collect her debts. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and cinematic. The people nearest the rear doors stopped speaking, their heads turning in unison. A collective sharp intake of breath sounded as they recognized the woman standing in the doorway. The silence rippled outward, moving through the dense crowd like a tidal wave. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Laughter died abruptly in people's throats. The live band, noticing the sudden vacuum of sound, faltered, missing a crucial beat before trailing off into complete dead silence. The elite crowd parted automatically, creating a wide, clear path directly through the center of the ballroom. Whispers erupted like wildfire as the most powerful people in Atlanta realized that Kiara, the actual visionary architect, the real powerhouse behind the city's greatest commercial developments, was standing before them looking like an avenging angel. At the bar, Julian had just raised his glass to make a toast. He turned his head casually, a relaxed smile on his face, to see what had completely silenced the massive room. Our eyes locked across the long expanse of the ballroom. The arrogant smile melted from his face instantly. It was replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated primal terror. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a freshly exhumed corpse. He stared at me, at my crimson dress, at my perfect health, as if he were looking at a ghost. His fingers went completely slack. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his paralyzed grip. It plummeted downward, seeming to fall in extreme slow motion before shattering violently against the polished marble floor. The sharp, explosive sound of breaking glass echoed like a gunshot in the dead silent room, sending a spray of expensive vintage champagne across his polished dress shoes. He did not even blink. He just stared at me, his entire perfectly constructed world disintegrating before his eyes. Near the center tables, Beverly finally turned around to locate the source of the commotion. I watched the brutal cognitive dissonance hit her brain. She saw me standing there glowing with vitality and terrifying intent, and her meticulously constructed reality completely fractured. Pure, unfiltered panic flashed in her wide eyes. The gala, the diamonds, the stolen millions, all of it threatened to collapse. But Beverly was a survivor of the social climbing trenches. She quickly plastered a desperate, frantic fake smile across her face, stretching her lips over her teeth. She practically shoved a tech executive aside, rushing forward to intercept me before I could reach the center of the room. She opened her arms wide, projecting the image of a delighted, incredibly concerned mother-in-law rushing to greet her ailing family member. "Kiara, sweetheart," she called out, her voice tight and entirely too loud for the silent room. "What are you doing out of bed? You should be resting. You are entirely too weak for this." I did not even break my stride. I did not acknowledge her outstretched arms. I did not acknowledge her forced, syrupy greeting or her desperate attempt to control the narrative. As she moved to embrace me, I simply kept walking. I bypassed her entirely, my shoulder brushing past hers with icy indifference, leaving her standing foolishly in the middle of the floor with her arms embracing empty air. The entire room watched the brutal, silent rejection. I kept my eyes fixed dead ahead, ignoring the stares, the whispers, and my husband's paralyzed terror. My heels clicked rhythmically against the marble floor, a steady countdown to their total annihilation. I walked straight past the extravagant centerpieces, straight past the frozen catering staff, and walked directly toward the main stage and the polished silver microphone waiting in the center. I ascended the 3 carpeted steps to the main stage, moving with the deliberate predatory grace of an apex predator circling its trapped prey. The grand ballroom remained trapped in a suffocating, breathless silence. Hundreds of pairs of eyes followed my every movement. I reached the center of the stage and wrapped my hand around the cool, polished steel of the microphone stand. I adjusted it slightly upward, the subtle movement sending a sharp, piercing whine of audio feedback through the massive suspended speakers. Several guests winced, but nobody dared look away. I looked out over the sea of upturned faces. I saw the mayor of Atlanta standing near the front row, his brow furrowed in confusion. I saw tech moguls, commercial developers, and elite private investors, the exact people Beverly had desperately wanted to impress, all standing completely paralyzed, waiting for my first word. My gaze swept past them, finding Beverly still frozen in the center of the room. Her arms awkwardly lowered, her face a mask of absolute terror. Tasha stood a few feet behind her, the cheap sequins of her silver dress catching the light, her expression vacillating between confusion and profound stupidity. Finally, I found Julian. He was still rooted to his spot by the mahogany bar, staring at me over the shattered remains of his crystal champagne flute. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice amplified, rich, and perfectly steady, echoing through the cavernous ballroom. "Please accept my deepest apologies for the dramatic interruption. I know I was not listed on the official program for tonight's festivities. In fact, many of you were likely told I was at home resting, recovering from a severe illness." I let a soft, razor-sharp smile touch my lips. "But as you can see, rumors of my demise have been greatly exaggerated. I simply could not miss this historic evening. I am Kiara, the lead structural architect and principal director of the commercial development firm that many of you in this room have worked with over the past decade." A ripple of recognition swept through the crowd. Men and women in tailored suits nodded, murmuring their approval to one another. I held up a hand asking for silence, and the room instantly complied. "We are gathered here tonight under the guise of a standard charity gala." I continued, keeping my eyes locked dead onto Beverly's panic-stricken face. "But this is not a standard evening. Tonight is a debut. Tonight is a celebration of unprecedented, monumental philanthropy. And the women responsible for this historic generosity are standing right here among you." I extended my arm, pointing gracefully toward the center of the room. The spotlight operators, completely entranced by the drama, immediately swiveled their massive overhead beams, pinning Beverly and Tasha in 2 blinding circles of white light. The crowd physically parted around them, leaving them entirely isolated on the marble floor. Tasha instinctively preened under the spotlight, a greedy, confused smile stretching across her face. Beverly, however, looked like a woman standing on the gallows, waiting for the trap door to open. Her chest was heaving, her emerald green gown trembling with every ragged breath. For the past several months, my brilliant mother-in-law Beverly and my ambitious sister-in-law Tasha have been working tirelessly in the shadows. I announced, my tone dripping with honeyed poison. They have been quietly liquidating assets, moving massive amounts of capital, and structuring a highly sophisticated Delaware shell company. Tasha serves as the sole executive visionary of this enterprise, while Beverly stands as the primary financial signatory. They wanted to keep their enterprise a secret, but true generosity should never be hidden in the dark. I paused, letting the anticipation build until the air in the ballroom felt thick enough to cut with a knife. I shifted my gaze to Julian. He was gripping the edge of the bar so hard his knuckles were stark white. He knew exactly what was coming, and he was entirely powerless to stop it. Just yesterday afternoon, using their newly formed corporate entity, Tasha and Beverly executed a master transfer, I declared, projecting my voice to the furthest corners of the room. They authorized an irrevocable charitable donation of $4.5 million directly to a highly specialized educational trust. The ballroom erupted. Mayors, bankers, and tycoons let out synchronized gasps of absolute shock before breaking into a thunderous, deafening wave of applause. People were cheering, raising their glasses, and stomping their feet. In their world, a $4.5 million spontaneous donation was the ultimate flex of supreme financial dominance. They were clapping for the sheer magnitude of the wealth being displayed. I looked down at Beverly and Tasha. Tasha was clapping along with the crowd, completely oblivious to her own execution. She thought I was publicly validating her as a wealthy mogul. But Beverly understood. The blood had completely abandoned Beverly's face, leaving her skin a sickening ashen gray. Her jaw hung slack, her eyes wide and bloodshot. The word irrevocable echoed in her mind, crushing her completely. She knew exactly what it meant. She could not pull the money back. She could not cancel the transfer. She could not scream that the money was stolen without admitting to federal wire fraud in a room full of politicians and powerful investors. She was legally, physically, and socially trapped in a nightmare of her own making. This irrevocable trust, I continued raising my voice over the swelling applause, will completely finance full-ride scholarships for brilliant underprivileged students pursuing degrees in structural engineering and commercial architecture at historically Black colleges and universities across the nation. Tasha and Beverly have ensured that the next generation of Black builders and architects will graduate completely debt-free. Their legacy is now permanently legally sealed. The crowd went wild. A standing ovation began to ripple from the front rows, sweeping backward, until every single elite guest in the St. Regis ballroom was on their feet, cheering for the two women trembling in the spotlight. I waited for the applause to reach a deafening crescendo before leaning close to the microphone one last time. I lowered my voice, turning it into a lethal, intimate purr that carried directly over the speakers. Of course, such monumental philanthropy comes with profound responsibilities, I said, locking eyes with Julian. I want to take a moment to personally recognize my husband, Julian. He has worked so incredibly hard this week managing the heavy burdens of this transaction. He even rewarded himself this very morning with a beautiful brand new $200,000 custom Porsche. A well-deserved trophy for a man who orchestrated such a flawless permanent transfer of wealth. Julian looked like he was going to vomit. The two commercial developers standing next to him slapped him enthusiastically on the back, congratulating him on his new car and his family's incredible generosity. He swayed on his feet, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but no sound came out. I hope you enjoy every single second of this victory, Julian, I said, my voice turning to absolute ice. And Beverly, Tasha, I highly recommend you consult with your tax attorneys first thing Monday morning. The IRS will be absolutely fascinated by the gift tax liabilities generated by a $4.5 million sudden liquidation. But do not let the impending federal audits dampen your spirits tonight. You have bought your way into Atlanta high society exactly like you always wanted. I stepped back from the microphone, the sharp screech of feedback cutting through the applause one final time. I did not wait for a response. I did not stay to watch them try to navigate the suffocating, inescapable trap I had just locked around their throats. I turned my back on the cheering crowd, the shattered champagne glass, and the three parasites who thought they could feast on my life's work. I descended the stage steps, my crimson gown flowing heavily behind me. The sea of wealthy elites parted for me once again, their faces bright with admiration and respect. I walked straight through the center of the grand ballroom, keeping my head high and my posture unyielding. I passed Beverly and Tasha without a single sideways glance, leaving them to drown in the spotlight of their own total destruction. I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors, stepping out into the cool, quiet marble hallway of the hotel lobby. The music and the applause faded behind me, replaced by the steady, victorious rhythm of my own footsteps. The music and the applause faded behind me, replaced by the steady, victorious rhythm of my own footsteps. But as I reached the end of the marble corridor, a sudden realization stopped me dead in my tracks. A verbal announcement was a powerful weapon, but these were corporate sharks and political opportunists. They lived by contracts, ledgers, and hard visual proof. I had left the stage before delivering the ultimate absolute coup de grace. I turned on my heels, the heavy crimson silk of my gown snapping around my legs, and marched right back to the towering mahogany doors. I pushed them open with renewed force, stepping back into the overwhelming heat and light of the grand ballroom. The room was still buzzing with chaotic, frenzied energy from my initial appearance. But the moment I reappeared, the murmurs died instantly. The crowd parted for a second time, allowing me a clear, unobstructed path back to the front. I ascended the carpeted steps and took the stage once more. The entire ballroom watched in dead, breathless silence. I looked down at the floor directly in front of the stage where my husband and his co-conspirators stood paralyzed. Tasha looked like she was about to be physically sick. Her hands were trembling violently, and the cheap silver sequins of her dress seemed to mock her pale, sweating face. I gripped the microphone, adjusting it slightly. I projected my voice, allowing it to ring with chilling, elegant composure. I am so honored to be here tonight to celebrate the unparalleled generosity of my mother-in-law, Beverly, and my sister-in-law, Tasha. I raised my right hand and gestured sharply toward the glass-enclosed control booth suspended at the back of the room. I gave the lead technician the prearranged signal. The lights in the massive ballroom instantly dimmed, plunging the elite crowd into dramatic shadows. A soft mechanical hum vibrated through the air as a colossal digital projection screen descended slowly behind me, unrolling to cover the entire back wall of the stage. The AV team executed the sequence flawlessly. The massive screen flashed to life, casting a brilliant, blinding blue and white glow over the hundreds of upturned faces. Projected in massive high-definition resolution was an enormous novelty check. It bore the exact official logo of Tasha and Beverly's newly minted Delaware Shell Company. The payee line was filled out in bold, elegant typography, dedicating the funds to the HBCU Structural Engineering and Architecture Foundation. And right there in the center, taking up half the screen, was the undeniable, unchangeable amount of $4,500,000. Next to the check image, the screen displayed the official digital certification from the Federal Banking Authority. It showed the clearing sequence, the irrevocable trust designation, and the timestamp from yesterday afternoon, proving the transaction was permanent and legally binding. The visual evidence was absolute. There were no loopholes, no margins for error, and no possibility of a retraction. The crowd of Atlanta's most powerful citizens stared up at the massive glowing numbers. For a split second, the sheer scale of the display held them in a stunned collective trance. Then the ballroom absolutely exploded. The eruption of noise was deafening. It was not just polite high society clapping. It was a thunderous, roaring, standing ovation. Mayors, tech moguls, and ruthless real estate tycoons began cheering wildly. They raised their champagne flutes high in the air, saluting the magnificent philanthropic display. They were completely mesmerized by the sheer volume of wealth being given away. They believed they were witnessing the birth of a new, powerful philanthropic dynasty. The applause rolled over the room in massive physical waves, echoing off the vaulted ceilings and rattling the crystal chandeliers. I stood center stage, bathed in the glow of the massive digital check, soaking in the roaring adulation. But my eyes never left the three people standing at the foot of the stage. The reality of the glowing screen hit Tasha like a physical blow to the stomach. The undeniable proof of the transfer, the federal certification, the irrevocable designation, all of it crashed down on her narrow shoulders. Her knees completely buckled under the weight of her own ruin. She collapsed downward, her hands clutching the edge of a linen-draped cocktail table, just to keep herself from hitting the marble floor. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she stared up at her own name stamped across a $4.5 million donation she could never, ever take back. Beverly looked entirely destroyed. The smug, arrogant social climber who had spent the last hour working the room dripping in diamonds and demanding imported caviar was gone. Her face turned a horrifying ashen gray. The muscles in her neck strained as she stared at the screen. She was a woman who understood the ruthless mechanics of wealth, and she recognized the federal certification seals projected behind me. She knew the money was permanently gone. She also knew that the IRS would immediately target her as the primary financial signatory of the shell company. She was standing in a room full of the exact elite society she had worshipped her entire life, and they were giving her a standing ovation for her own financial execution. She tried to reach out to Tasha, but her hands were shaking too violently to offer any support. Beverly's emerald green gown suddenly looked like a mocking costume. She was suffocating in plain sight, drowning in the applause of the people she had tried to impress. Every single clap, every single cheer was another nail in her financial coffin. They were blindly, enthusiastically celebrating her complete and total bankruptcy. Julian was entirely catatonic. He had not moved a single muscle since he dropped his champagne glass. The spilled wine was soaking into his expensive Italian leather shoes, but he did not notice. He was staring at me with a hollow, vacant expression. The brilliant corporate attorney, the master manipulator, the man who thought he could steal my life's work while playing. The devoted husband was completely broken. He saw the federal seals on the screen and realized that Darius had not just frozen the funds. We had structurally transformed them. Julian knew he could not stop the transfer without confessing to wire fraud. He knew his mother and sister were going to face millions in tax liabilities. He knew his career, his freedom, and his life were over. The crowd continued to cheer, completely oblivious to the absolute tragedy unfolding in the center of the room. A prominent city councilman clapped Julian hard on the back, shouting his congratulations over the roaring noise. Julian flinched, as if he had been struck, staring blankly at the councilman before turning his haunted eyes back to me. I maintained my elegant, chilling composure. I did not gloat. I did not sneer. I simply looked down at them with the cold, detached efficiency of an architect admiring a perfectly executed demolition. The structural integrity of their lies had been completely compromised, and I was watching the building collapse exactly according to my blueprints. The live jazz quartet, swept up in the incredible energy of the room, began playing a lively, triumphant melody. The music swelled, blending with the applause and the cheering. The AV team transitioned the massive screen from the novelty check to a looping slideshow of the historic university campuses that would benefit from the trust. Pictures of beautiful brick buildings, lush libraries, and eager students flashed above my head, reinforcing the permanent, tangible reality of the donation. I stepped back from the microphone, allowing the applause to wash over the stage. I had given them exactly what they wanted. I had given them the most talked about, the most spectacular, and the most expensive gala in the history of Atlanta society. They wanted to use my wealth to make a name for themselves, and I had guaranteed that nobody in this room would ever forget the names Beverly and Tasha. They would be remembered as the greatest forced philanthropists the city had ever seen. I turned smoothly, my crimson train gliding gracefully across the stage, and walked toward the side exit. I did not look back at the suffocating trio. I did not need to. The trap was permanently shut, the locks were sealed, and the federal government was already waiting in the shadows. I walked down the stage stairs and slipped through the side doors, leaving the deafening roar of applause echoing in my wake. The execution was flawless. Now it was time to let the venom work its way through their system. Let them squirm in the spotlight of their own ruin. Let them choke on the applause they had so desperately craved. My work here was absolutely finished. I stepped down from the stage, the deafening roar of applause still shaking the crystal chandeliers above. Instead of heading straight for the exit, I altered my path, moving with the deliberate grace of a predator closing in on a cornered kill. I walked directly toward the polished mahogany bar, where Julian stood absolutely paralyzed. The elite crowd parted for me, their faces glowing with admiration and awe. They clapped enthusiastically, raising their vintage champagne flutes in a joyous salute. They truly believed I was a proud family member honoring my brilliant in-laws. They had absolutely no idea they were providing the cheerful soundtrack to a brutal financial execution. Julian's custom velvet tuxedo suddenly looked entirely too large for his shrinking frame. The arrogant, suave corporate king had completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man. His face was a horrifying shade of translucent white, a stark contrast to the dark velvet of his jacket. He was staring at me with eyes so wide they looked perfectly round, completely devoid of their usual condescending warmth. The spilled vintage champagne was actively seeping into his imported Italian leather shoes, but he lacked the basic motor function to step backward. He was frozen in time, watching his carefully curated empire burn to ash. I stopped mere inches from him, invading his personal space with unyielding dominance. He did not move. He did not blink. He was barely breathing. The scent of his expensive bespoke cologne mixed violently with the sharp, sour stench of genuine human panic. I leaned in close, tilting my head until my lips were brushing the edge of his ear. The crowd's continuous cheering masked our conversation perfectly, creating a private, intimate bubble of absolute terror just for him. I kept my voice perfectly level, an elegant, venomous whisper, designed to slice straight through his remaining sanity. If you march up to that stage and claim the money is actually yours, you will have to look the mayor and those city council members in the eye and publicly confess to massive federal wire fraud. I murmured my words flowing like ice water directly into his ear canal. You will have to admit, you forged my signature on those Delaware Shell Company documents to steal your sick wife's life savings. You will go to a maximum security federal prison for a very long time. Your career, your law license, and your precious reputation will be instantly annihilated. I felt him shudder, a violent, uncontrollable, full-body tremor that rattled his tuxedo jacket. I let a cold, razor-sharp smile touch my lips and continued. But if you choose to stay silent and accept this magnificent applause, you legally validate the transfer. You legally confirm that your new shell company just gifted $4.5 million to charity. Do you know what the Internal Revenue Service charges for a gift tax on a transaction of that magnitude, Julian? It is exactly 40%. You and your lovely family currently owe the federal government $1.8 million in cash immediately. Cash you do not have on money you no longer possess. Checkmate. A few yards away, near the center of the ballroom, the reality of the mathematical trap finally penetrated Beverly's greed-soaked brain. She was staring up at the glowing digital check on the massive projection screen, her lips moving soundlessly as she calculated the catastrophic tax liability. The heavily armored socialite facade she wore completely cracked and disintegrated. Her eyes rolled back into her head, showing only the whites. Her knees gave out, entirely unable to support the crushing weight of her own ruin. She did not just swoon gracefully. She collapsed with the heavy dead weight of a felled oak tree crashing backward directly into a towering high-end catering table. Silver serving platters spun violently into the air. A massive crystal bowl filled with imported beluga caviar shattered explosively against the marble floor, launching expensive black fish roe across the polished tiles. Slices of artisanal smoked salmon dill cream, fresh and delicate toasted blinis, flew in every direction, staining her vibrant emerald green designer gown. She hit the floor in a humiliating tangle of ruined silk and crushed appetizers, pulling the heavy white linen tablecloth down on top of her. The surrounding high society guests gasped in horror, rushing forward to surround her. "Give her air," a prominent tech mogul shouted, completely misinterpreting the situation. The pure emotion of her own generosity has overwhelmed her. Tasha did not even try to help her unconscious mother. She was folded completely in half, holding her stomach and hyperventilating so hard she sounded like she was physically choking. She was the sole executive officer of the fraudulent shell company. She had eagerly signed the incorporation papers because they wanted to insulate Julian from any direct ties to the stolen funds. Now the entire massive, crushing weight of the impending IRS audit was going to fall squarely onto her shoulders. She grabbed the collar of her cheap silver dress, tearing desperately at the sequins, trying to pull oxygen into her seizing lungs. She was drowning in a sea of applause. Seeing his mother unconscious in a pile of fish eggs and his sister dry, heaving on the marble floor, finally snapped Julian out of his catatonic state. The cool, collected facade shattered completely, revealing a desperate, sweating, cornered animal. He reached out with trembling hands and grabbed my bare arm. His fingers dug into my skin with a terrifying, frantic strength, his manicured nails biting into my flesh. "Kiara, please," he begged, his voice cracking loudly, pitching into a pathetic, desperate whine. "You have to stop this. You have to call Darius right now and reverse the smart contract. I will give it all back. I swear to God I will give every single penny back to you. I will sign whatever documents you want. Just pull the money back out of the trust. We will lose everything, Kiara. The IRS will seize the house. They will garnish my wages. They will put us in jail." He was actively panting, his perfectly styled hair falling limply into his eyes. "You are my wife. You love me. You cannot do this to your own family." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. I felt absolutely nothing for this man. No anger, no sorrow, no lingering affection, and certainly no pity. There was only a cold, clinical disgust. I raised my opposite hand and clamped it over his wrist. I did not rush the movement. I methodically pried his trembling fingers off my skin one by one, forcing his hand away with unyielding iron strength. I stepped back, smoothing the crimson silk of my gown where he had dared to touch it. "I am not your wife, Julian," I said, my voice dead hollow and carrying the absolute finality of a judge passing sentence. "I am your executioner, and irrevocable means exactly what it says. It is permanent. There is no reversal protocol. There is no magic undo button. The money belongs to the HBCU Foundation now. You built this trap with your own greed, and now you're going to bleed out inside of it." He opened his mouth to beg again, to offer me more empty promises and desperate lies. But a sudden, sharp shift in the room's energy instantly silenced him. The crowd gathered near the grand entrance began to part, nervously murmuring in profound confusion. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom had swung open once more, hitting the walls with a heavy thud. 3 men walked purposefully through the threshold. They were not wearing celebratory tuxedos. They wore dark, immaculate government-issued suits. They carried identical black leather briefcases and possessed the grim, no-nonsense demeanor of men who destroyed lives for a living. They did not pause to admire the melting ice sculptures, the frantic guests, or the shattered caviar bowl. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, scanning the opulent crowd until they locked eyes directly on Julian. It was the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Economic Crimes Unit. Darius had flagged Julian's unauthorized asset transfers days ago, setting the federal gears in motion, perfectly timed, to coincide with the climax of the gala. The trap had not just snapped shut. It had locked, bolted, and completely swallowed the key. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom had swung open, hitting the walls with a heavy, resounding thud. 3 men walked purposefully through the threshold. They were not wearing celebratory tuxedos or designer evening wear. They wore dark, immaculate government-issued suits. They carried identical black leather briefcases and possessed the grim, no-nonsense demeanor of men who destroyed lives for a living. They did not pause to admire the melting ice sculptures, the frantic high society guests, or the shattered caviar bowl. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, scanning the opulent crowd until they locked eyes directly on Julian. It was the Federal Bureau of Investigation Economic Crimes Unit. Darius had flagged Julian's unauthorized asset transfers days ago, setting the federal gears in motion, perfectly timed to coincide with the climax of the gala. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had locked, bolted, and completely swallowed the key. The live jazz quartet abruptly stopped playing. The sudden absence of music left the grand room echoing with the sharp, aggressive clicking of the agent's hard-soled shoes against the marble floor. The Atlanta elite are highly attuned to sudden shifts in power, and they instantly recognize the scent of real blood in the water. The deafening applause that had just celebrated Beverly and Tasha morphed into a low, vicious hum of hungry, aggressive whispering. Cell phones materialized from expensive designer clutches and tailored suit pockets. Hundreds of high-definition lenses focused dead center on the tragedy unfolding by the mahogany bar. The bright white flashes of camera lights illuminated Julian's chalk-white face. He took a single unsteady step backward, bumping heavily against the brass rail of the bar, effectively trapping himself. The lead federal agent, a towering man with a jaw carved from absolute granite, stepped directly into Julian's personal space. The agent did not shout. He did not need to raise his voice at all. His tone possessed the quiet, terrifying gravity of absolute authority. "Julian Vance," the agent stated, holding up a thick, leather-bound badge that flashed gold under the massive crystal chandeliers. "We need you to step away from the bar and come with us immediately. We have several urgent questions regarding highly suspicious wealth management activity connected to your private banking accounts and a newly formed Delaware limited liability company." Julian's mouth opened, but only a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze escaped his throat. The 2 prominent commercial developers who had been enthusiastically praising him mere seconds ago practically leapt backward, treating him like he was highly infectious. "There has been a mistake," Julian finally stammered, his voice cracking violently in the dead silent room. "This is a massive misunderstanding. I am a respected wealth management director. I have done absolutely nothing wrong. The lead agent did not even blink. We have digital audit trails forged, signature timestamps, and unauthorized asset transfers flagged directly by the Federal Banking Authority. Put your hands where I can see them, Mr. Vance. Across the marble floor, the phrase limited liability company acted like a bucket of freezing ice water poured directly over Tasha's head. She was the sole executive officer of that fraudulent shell company. Her name was printed in bold ink on every single forged document. Her violent hyperventilation abruptly stopped, replaced by the sheer adrenaline-fueled instinct of a cornered rat. She realized she was about to be handcuffed in front of the entire city. She kicked off her cripplingly high silver stiletto heels, abandoning them next to the rapidly melting swan ice sculpture. With her cheap sequined dress hiked up around her thighs, Tasha made a desperate, completely undignified sprint toward the swinging double doors of the catering kitchen. It was an act of pure comedic desperation. The high society guests actively moved out of her way, shrinking back to avoid touching her, while raising their phones higher to capture the spectacular display of cowardice. Tasha hit the kitchen doors shoulder first, bursting into the stainless steel staging area, only to bounce hard off the solid chest of a massive, heavily armed tactical police officer. The FBI had not come to the St. Regis alone. The Atlanta Police Department had quietly locked down every single exit in the building. Two uniformed officers grabbed Tasha by the arms, dragging her backward through the swinging doors and thrusting her into the blinding light of the ballroom. She was thrashing, crying, and screaming at the top of her lungs. It was his idea, she wailed, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at Julian. Julian made me sign the papers. I did not know the money was stolen. He told me it was a legitimate real estate venture. She instantly sold out her brother without a second thought, desperately trying to save her own skin. The wealthy crowd captured every pathetic, humiliating second in crystal-clear high-definition video. The violent commotion and Tasha's shrieking finally stirred Beverly from her caviar-stained slumber. She groaned heavily, rolling over on the cold marble floor. Her extravagant emerald green evening gown was completely ruined, smeared with crushed blinis, rich dill cream, and expensive black fish roe. She blinked heavily, struggling to clear her double vision. The first thing she saw was not the adoring, envious faces of Atlanta's elite society. It was the frantic, rhythmic strobing of bright red and blue police lights reflecting off the ballroom's towering floor-to-ceiling glass terrace doors. Multiple police cruisers had completely surrounded the hotel. Beverly pushed herself up onto her elbows, pieces of smoked salmon peeling off her expensive fabric and dropping to the floor. She looked up and realized the brutal reality of her situation. The city's most powerful figures, the mayors, the tech moguls, the real estate tycoons she had desperately tried to buy were standing in a wide circle around her. They were not offering to help her up. They were not asking if she was injured. They were pointing their phones downward, recording her absolute humiliation. Someone in the crowd let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Beverly's meticulously constructed high society debut had transformed into a viral digital circus. The phantom wealth she thought she possessed was gone, and all that remained was the pathetic reality of a thief caught red-handed. She scrambled to her knees, smearing more fish eggs across her cheek, frantically searching the room for Julian, hoping her golden child could somehow fix the catastrophic disaster. I stood perfectly still by the main exit doors, completely untouched by the magnificent, chaotic storm ravaging the room. The air around me felt incredibly clean, untainted by the desperation and greed suffocating my soon-to-be ex-family. Julian was currently backed firmly against the bar, two federal agents boxing him in, while the lead agent recited a lengthy list of financial crimes that would keep him buried inside a federal courtroom for the next decade. He looked like a terrified, lost little boy, his custom velvet tuxedo suddenly seeming like a ridiculous costume. I walked forward, my heavy crimson silk train gliding silently over the floor, slicing a clean path through the circle of recording guests. The federal agents saw me approaching and instinctively tightened their formation, moving to block my path. I simply raised a single manicured hand, holding a thick, crisp manila envelope. "Agents," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise with polite, icy precision. I apologize for the interruption, but I have a highly time-sensitive delivery for your current suspect. The lead agent glanced at me, recognized the undeniable absolute authority in my posture, and took a half-step back. He gestured with his hand, allowing me to stand directly in front of the man who had tried to steal my life. I held the thick envelope out. Julian stared at it, his eyes completely bloodshot. Heavy beads of sweat rolled down his forehead, ruining his expensive grooming. His hands were shaking violently as he reached out and took the envelope from my grasp. "What is this, Kiara?" he whispered. His voice completely shattered, empty of all its former arrogant warmth. "Just a few administrative details to officially wrap up the evening," I replied, projecting my voice perfectly so the surrounding cell phone cameras could capture every single brutal word. "Inside that envelope, you will find fully executed divorce papers filed this morning citing extreme financial infidelity and grand fraud. Behind those papers, you will find a certified 30-day eviction notice for your mother and your sister." Julian flinched as if I had physically struck him across the face. "They have been living rent-free in a luxury condominium that I personally own," I continued, my tone completely devoid of mercy. "Since you recklessly liquidated the hidden accounts they were planning to use for their new glamorous lifestyle, they will need to vacate my property immediately. They have exactly 30 days to pack their cheap bags and find a new place to live." The realization of absolute total ruin hit Julian with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. The walls of his reality caved in simultaneously. He had permanently lost the $4.5 million. He had lost his freedom to the federal government. He had lost his family's shelter. And he had completely lost his mind. His legs gave out entirely. Julian Vance, the arrogant, polished wealth management director who thought he could outsmart me, collapsed heavily to his knees right there on the champagne-soaked marble floor. He ruined his expensive custom velvet tuxedo, ignoring the sharp shards of broken crystal biting deeply into his knees. He threw his hands forward, desperately grabbing the crimson silk fabric of my dress. He buried his face against my legs and began sobbing hysterically. He wailed, begging for forgiveness, pleading with me to save him, weeping with loud, ugly, pathetic, gasping breaths in front of the entire Atlanta elite. "Kiara, please," he sobbed, his tears soaking into my gown. "I am so sorry. Please do not do this. Do not leave me like this." I looked down at the top of his perfectly styled head. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of remorse. I did not even blink. I reached down and effortlessly pried his desperate, clinging fingers off my silk gown, letting his weak hands drop limply back to the floor. I turned on my heel, leaving him kneeling and screaming in the shattered debris of his ruined empire, and walked out into the cool night air. The cool night air of Buckhead washed over my bare shoulders, feeling crisp and incredibly clean after the suffocating, humid atmosphere of the St. Regis ballroom. The valet brought my car around instantly, his eyes wide and darting, having clearly heard the violent commotion and seen the flashing red and blue police cruisers blockading the entrance. I slipped behind the wheel of my car, the soft, immaculate leather a comforting embrace, and pulled smoothly out of the cobblestone driveway. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I drove through the quiet, manicured streets of Atlanta while the sirens wailed in the distance behind me, singing a beautiful symphony of absolute justice. My house was perfectly silent when I walked through the front door, untouched by the toxic presence that had haunted it for so long. The immediate aftermath of the gala was swift and devastatingly public. By sunrise the next morning, the spectacular implosion of the Vance family was the headline on every local news outlet and high society gossip blog. The digital videos recorded by the stunned gala guests spread across the internet like a raging, uncontainable wildfire. There was high-definition footage of Beverly lying face down in the imported caviar, Tasha violently resisting the police in her ruined sequined dress, and Julian sobbing pathetically on his knees in his stained velvet tuxedo. The city devoured the scandal with a ruthless, insatiable appetite. They had tried to elevate their social standing using my wealth and my reputation, and instead they became the most notorious cautionary tale in the history of the Southern elite. Their names became punchlines, synonymous with catastrophic greed. The federal government operates with a terrifying, relentless efficiency when presented with an airtight case of wire fraud. Within a matter of weeks, Julian's carefully constructed professional life was dismantled piece by piece, pulverized into dust. The Securities and Exchange Commission immediately and permanently revoked his wealth management licenses. The State Bar Association stripped him of his legal credentials, stamping his name with a permanent public disgrace that could never be expunged. His prestigious corner office at the firm was cleared out by security guards before he even managed to post his exorbitant bail. The federal prosecutors did not offer him a lenient plea deal or a gentle slap on the wrist. They saw a man who had forged federal documents and manipulated banking systems to defraud his own wife, and they decided to make a brutal, very public example of him. The federal indictment came down with crushing weight, outlining multiple felony counts of aggravated wire fraud, identity theft, and financial conspiracy. Because his assets were frozen and his reputation was destroyed, his high-priced defense attorneys dropped him, demanding massive retainers he could no longer afford. He was forced to sit at the defense table with an overworked public defender, listening as his former colleagues eagerly testified against him to save their own skins. He was left entirely defenseless, facing a mandatory minimum of 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The arrogant corporate shark who thought he was the smartest man in every room was reduced to a terrified, disgraced inmate, stripped of his tailored suits, his arrogance, and his freedom. Tasha's destruction was entirely financial and completely suffocating, a slow drowning in a sea of debt she created. She had eagerly signed her name as the sole executive officer of the Delaware Shell Company, dreaming of the lavish lifestyle she believed she was inherently entitled to. She never possessed the intellect to consider the legal liability of her greed. The Internal Revenue Service moved in with ruthless, terrifying speed. Because the $4.5 million had been legally executed as an irrevocable charitable gift, the massive $1.8 million tax penalty fell directly onto her narrow shoulders. The IRS issued an immediate, unyielding freeze on every single bank account associated with her name or her social security number. Her personal checking accounts, her meager savings, her business accounts, everything was locked down tighter than a federal vault. Her vanity boutique, the business she had used to parade around as a self-made successful entrepreneur, collapsed in a matter of days. Without access to capital, her rent checks bounced immediately. Her suppliers cut her off entirely, refusing to send a single garment. Creditors arrived with official court orders seizing her entire inventory down to the last cheap imported handbag. They chained the glass doors of her boutique and taped a glaring fluorescent seizure notice to the front window for the entire shopping district to read. Her credit cards were declined at grocery stores and gas stations, leaving her standing at registers in utter humiliation. The fake glamorous life she had broadcasted to the world was violently repossessed, leaving her with nothing but a mountain of federal tax debt she would be paying off for the rest of her natural life. Beverly's punishment was the exact nightmare she had spent her entire superficial life running from. She had dedicated decades to ruthless social climbing, manipulating her way into exclusive circles, and pretending to possess generational wealth she never actually earned. The gala was supposed to be her ultimate crowning achievement, her grand ascension into the highest tier of Atlanta society. Instead, it became the site of her total excommunication. The elite society women she had desperately tried to impress completely cut her out overnight. Her country club membership was quietly but firmly revoked, preventing her from even driving past the gates. Her phone stopped ringing entirely. No one invited her to charity luncheons, private galas, or even casual afternoon teas. She became a complete social pariah, a toxic laughingstock that people avoided making eye contact with at the grocery store. To cover the mounting catastrophic legal fees for Julian and Tasha, Beverly was forced to leverage everything she had left to her name. She took out massive high-interest loans against her own property, hoping to keep her golden children out of federal prison. But the legal bills were a bottomless black hole, swallowing every dime she poured into it. When the payments inevitably lapsed, the bank moved in without mercy. Her home went into immediate aggressive foreclosure. The bank scheduled a public auction, placing a massive, humiliating foreclosure sign right on her pristine front lawn. She was forced to pack her belongings into cheap cardboard boxes and vacate the premises, abandoning the zip code she had fought so fiercely to inhabit. She moved into a cramped run-down apartment miles away from the city center, left entirely bankrupt, socially ruined, and completely alone. I lost $4.5 million that night. It was a massive sum of money, a staggering amount of liquid capital that I had worked incredibly hard to earn through years of relentless dedication. But I did not mourn the loss for a single second. I wrote it off as a brilliant strategic tax deduction for my commercial development firm, and more importantly, I considered it the absolute necessary cost of my permanent absolute freedom. It was the precise surgical price of excising a malignant tumor from my life before it could spread and destroy everything I had built. 6 months after the gala, I stood firmly planted on the raw, uneven dirt of my newest commercial construction site. The morning sun beat down on my shoulders, warming the crisp white fabric of my tailored blouse. I wore a bright yellow hard hat and heavy steel-toed boots, holding a thick, heavy roll of architectural blueprints in my hands. The air was thick with the sharp scent of freshly poured concrete and the loud, rhythmic pounding of heavy machinery echoing across the lot. It was the beautiful, deafening sound of progress, of building something solid and real from the ground up. This project was a massive, multi-million-dollar commercial complex, an entire prime city block that I owned outright. My site managers and foremen walked around me with genuine respect, awaiting my directives. There were no hidden partners, no fraudulent shell companies, and absolutely no parasitic in-laws draining my resources from the shadows. I was the sole undisputed architect of my own empire, and the foundation beneath my feet was completely bulletproof. I unrolled the thick blueprints, running my hand over the complex, intricate structural diagrams that represented my vision brought to life. I looked out at the massive steel beams rising majestically toward the clear blue southern sky. Family is a word people use to excuse a multitude of horrific sins. They use it as a weapon, a relentless guilt trip, a heavy iron chain designed to keep you tethered to their own miserable dysfunction. They demand endless loyalty while offering absolutely nothing but betrayal in return. But I learned the hard way that true family has absolutely nothing to do with sharing a last name or a biological bloodline. It is entirely about sharing respect. It is about unwavering loyalty, radical honesty, and mutual elevation. Julian, Beverly, and Tasha tried to use my love and my success as a weakness. They injected their greed, their entitlement, and their endless deception into my life, hoping to slowly bleed me dry while smiling warmly to my face. They thought their venom would paralyze me. They thought I would quietly submit to their manipulation to preserve the fragile illusion of a happy, perfect marriage. They grossly underestimated the woman they were trying to break. I did not just survive their venom. I studied it. I weaponized it. I used it to permanently cure myself of their toxicity. I cut away the dead, rotting weight and cauterized the wound with absolute unyielding finality. I rolled the blueprints back up and tucked them firmly under my arm. The massive steel structure towering above me was a testament to my survival, a permanent monument to my unbreakable will. I smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that reached all the way to my eyes. I looked out at my expanding empire, completely untouchable and entirely free.